lot of ground to cover just to discuss some of the meeting logistics before we get going. My name is Logan Parker. I'm a Nightjar researcher in the Northeastern United States, and I'm one of the steering committee members for the Global Nightjar Network. This is the second day of our programming for 2023, and this is our third meeting. So if you're joining us again, welcome back. And if today is your first time joining the conference, welcome. So just to go over some of the logistics for how the meeting is going to run today. This meeting is recorded, so we will be editing the recordings and getting them posted within a week or so, and making those available. So if you missed any of the talks yesterday, or you're going to have to miss any talks today, you will have a chance to see those. We just ask that you keep your microphones muted throughout the day. It's just easier on our end and cuts down on any background noise, and helps keep things running smooth. We do encourage you to make use of the meeting chat. So you can click down at the bottom. There's a chat feature. We'll be using that for asking questions, but there will be opportunities for some discussion where you can put your cameras on and unmute, and we can have some dialogue back and forth. We do have a live captioning feature available. It isn't perfect. It does a pretty good job, but if you click down at the bottom of your Zoom window and click on More, you'll see the option to add captions. And we do have some presentations that will have captions within the actual presentation, so you can enable them and disable them if they're distracting to you and not valuable. So we do encourage you to ask questions following the presentations using the chat. If you could pre-type your questions, if you have questions during the talk, that's great. We just ask that you hold off on submitting them until towards the end of the talk, or right when we enter the Q&A period. And as we get going, we'd encourage you to submit some topics for those discussion periods that we discussed. We also have a new feature this year, which was we had a virtual poster session, and I'll have one of the steering committee members put a link to the Padlet where you can view those posters and make comments or add questions. That would be great. And we also are going to have a few different mediums for providing feedback. So if you need any immediate assistance, you can reach out to myself or any of the other people on the participant list that you see listed as a co-host. Those are our steering committee members. So they can help you if you have any immediate concerns. We also have a anonymous feedback form if there's something that you would like to share there. Like I said, it is anonymous, so we won't be able to respond directly, but if there's anything that you want to relay to us, we would be very happy to review that. We will also have a final survey that we'll send out to all participants following the conference. You can expect to see that within a week or so, to get some feedback from each of you. We review that feedback every year, and it very much informs what we do, what changes we make, what improvements we strive for each year. So with that, I'm gonna switch over and read our code of conduct. Just give me a moment. I've got a billion windows open, so of course it's not jumping to the front, but I will pull that up there. You'll also note that in the chat, we'll be sharing links throughout the day. So there will be links to the anonymous form. There will be links to this code of conduct if you'd like to review it. There are also links to our shop where we are, we've got t-shirts and stickers of the Global Nightjar Network logo. It's a really fantastic logo that was prepared by one of our steering committee members. And the funds from that and through our donation portal are being used for generating funding for a small research grant. So if you're inclined to give to either of those, that would be really greatly appreciated. And I will read our code of conduct before we get started, and then we'll move into our next session. So first and foremost, we're committed to maintaining a safe space for people of all backgrounds, especially marginalized groups, including Indigenous peoples, racial minorities, and members of the LGBTQ community. There's zero tolerance for bigotry and hate. Any racist, sexist, or insensitive comments will result in being removed from the meeting. If you have any concerns relating to these, feel free to contact one of us directly, as I mentioned, using the direct message feature in the chat, or else you can provide anonymous feedback in the form that I referenced. The chat is for conference-related questions only. Please hold any talk-related questions until towards the end of the presentation. Again, definitely encourage you to pre-type them just for time's sake. And we will indicate when the speaker is ready if they are available. Depending on the preference of the speaker, questions might be asked or answered either in the chat or spoken verbally. A moderator will do their best to provide a written transcript of any of the questions and answers within the chat. For native English speakers, remember that this is an international conference and English is not the primary language spoken by many of our presenters and attendees. It's therefore encouraged that you speak slowly, clearly, and enunciate as best you can. This will also help with the captioning. Please be patient with us conference organizers as we do our best to keep things running smoothly and strive to keep things inclusive. We're very open to feedback, and we'll provide a survey at the end of the conference. And lastly, let's have fun, learn about nightjars. All right, steering committee members, anything I forgot before we get going? I'm not hearing
this is great. Thank you,
okay.
Logan.
Okay, all right, excellent. Okay, so with that, we're gonna begin session 4, which is on breeding ecology. And we're going to start with a presentation from Grant Wytinski, who's a PhD student at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign in the US. The talk is titled, "Enough Moths for Breakfast, Lunch, and Dinner? Drivers of Prey Availability and Selection on Eastern Whippoorwill Breeding Grounds in Illinois, USA." And we'll have that presentation going for you in just a moment. Thank you.
All right, hello everyone. Thanks so much for coming to my talk today. I'm really excited to talk to you about my research on moth availability for whippoorwills here in Illinois. I'm just going to get right into it. So first off, just a little bit of background about moths. Moths, of course, are nocturnal insects. They're very diverse. They're critical in a lot of different ecosystems. They serve really important roles as herbivores, pollinators, and prey across the world. And they're mostly nocturnal. There are diurnal moths, but the vast majority of them are nocturnal. They come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. But today I'm just here to talk about their role as prey for nightjars, specifically eastern whippoorwills. Unfortunately, moths in general aren't doing very well. So here's a study from the United Kingdom looking at moth declines over 50 years between 1965 and 2005. So unfortunately, moths did decline quite a bit during that period, particularly in the south of the United Kingdom, where there are some bigger cities, more agricultural development. And as you can see, they're actually doing okay in the north, actually increasing just a tiny bit, but in the south, the declines are pretty steep, suggesting that human activity and land use change are really driving the declines, at least there in the UK. But moths, they're really important for a variety of species. So as I mentioned, they're pollinators. Some plants really specifically depend on moths. They will time their nectar production to peak during nocturnal hours or right before dusk, especially in arid areas. And a lot of nocturnal aerial insectivores like bats and, of course, nightjars depend on moths as a food source because they're abundant and they have a lot of good nutrients in there that are really beneficial for some of these species. One thing about nocturnal species in particular, like nightjars, is that they often will have limited windows of activity compared to diurnal species, which can be really restrictive on their ability to find enough food. So a little bit more about whippoorwills. They're visual predators like a lot of other nightjars. They look and spot prey with their eyes instead of echolocation. They use sally flights as their main foraging strategy, so they'll actually find a perch, catch a moth, and return to a perch as opposed to continuously flying. And whippoorwills are undergoing some pretty steep declines. So in the past, approximately 50 years, between 1966 and 2019, whippoorwill populations declined to about 40% of what they had been in North America, and only 9% of what they had been in the 60s here in Illinois. So some pretty steep declines, unfortunately, for whippoorwills. These declines led our research group to start this whippoorwill project a couple of years ago. And one of the things our lab does is collect fecal samples from whippoorwills to find out what they're actually eating. So in 2021 and 2022, we collected a bunch of fecal samples from whippoorwills in Illinois. We found out that moths make up about 83% of the sequences in those fecal samples that are identified to order using DNA metabarcoding. So really the vast majority of their diet is moths as far as we can tell, particularly large moths. Like 2/3 of the sequences that were identified to family actually came from these three macro moth families, larger moth families, generally speaking, Noctuidae, Geometridae, and Erebidae. So whippoorwills really depend on moths for food here in Illinois. Another study that our lab group did recently, this was from a master's student that just graduated in 2021 named Ian Souza Cole. He looked at whippoorwill activity over the course of a day, and he found that whippoorwills really aren't active very much compared to the diurnal species. So on the left there, you can see whippoorwill activity per day compared to 3 diurnal species. You can see it's about half as much. So the whippoorwills really don't have very much time to forage and do all the things that they need to do in a day. And they're mostly active, or their activity rates are highest at dawn and dusk, but they're also active for a decent portion of the night. And that portion varies quite a bit depending on moon. So on the right, there's a graph showing the moon score in black and yellow, which is the moon brightness multiplied by the number of minutes the moon is above the horizon. And then on in the blue is activity rates for male whippoorwills. And you can see they're going up and down with the moon cycles. So whippoorwills are more active on brighter moonlit nights, probably because they can see better and therefore forage more effectively for longer. Okay, so we know when whippoorwills are active, but we don't know very much about when moths are active on the landscape, specifically large moths in these landscapes where there's lots of forest and grassland complexes. So we wanted to know when and where large moths are active, whether they're available to whippoorwills throughout the night, and what kind of spatiotemporal factors are driving those activity patterns. And then once we had found out that, we wanted to think about what those patterns meant for large moths, their conservation, and the conservation of species that depend on them, like whippoorwills. So in order to get at those moth activity patterns, we conducted bucket trap excuse me, bucket trapping, geez, at 3 field sites in West Central Illinois. And those 3 field sites had or currently have pretty robust whippoorwill breeding populations. 2 of them are doing pretty well right now. We had 6 transects at each of our 3 field sites, and they all spanned forest and edge habitats. So we had 3 traps in the forest, 75 meters into the forest interior, 3 traps right along the forest grassland edge. All the traps were spaced 75 meters apart in order to account for the sampling radius of the traps being 30 meters or less. And we also had 3 traps in each habitat, and they were lit at different times of night. So one was lit for 90 minutes after civil dusk, one was lit for 90 minutes around solar midnight, the midpoint between dusk and dawn, and then one was lit for 90 minutes before civil dawn to get at those activity patterns throughout the night. After we collected all these samples, we sorted them by order and size, counted the moths in each sample, and biomassed them. We were focusing on moths with a body length greater than or equal to 10 millimeters, because that's what we found in previous research was positively associated with whippoorwill abundance. After we had collected all this data from our samples, we ran AICC models, generalized linear mixed models, on our samples, looking at 3 different response variables: the large moth count, the biomass of large moths, and then the mass of an individual moth on average per sample, which is the biomass divided by the count of moths. All of our models contained a random effect of trap location within transect identity to account for any microhabitat effects. And our 2 stages of model ranking, we had the first stage had 5 environmental variables. So moon score, which I mentioned before, is the amount of the moon illuminated, whether it's full or new moon or crescent, and then multiplied by the number of minutes that the moon is above the horizon during that sampling window. The sky code is a measure of how cloudy the sky is. We also had air temperature, wind speed, and relative humidity, and 3 potential interactions between those variables. In the second stage, we had 5 spatiotemporal variables: habitat type, time of night, sampling round, field site, and dominant tree cover. So each of our transects was visited multiple times throughout the summer. So that's what sampling round was accounting for. And then the dominant tree cover was just whether the dominant tree type was deciduous or coniferous. And then we also had 11 potential interactions between those variables. So our models had the potential to get very complex. What is shaping large moth availability? Well, the models did get quite complex. There's a lot of factors at play. Moths are very diverse and complicated. We're looking at a lot of different species, but there are still some really interesting trends that have potential to have implications for moth and whippoorwill conservation. So first, I want to take you through some spatial trends. The first interaction I want to show you is between the habitat and time of night. As you can see, the forest habitat has more moths in general. This is the moth abundance, and especially early in the evening relative to the edge habitat, which has pretty consistent lower levels of moths throughout the whole night. We look at sampling round interacting with habitat. We see that forest, again, has more moths in general. This is moth count again. But we see that difference is especially distinct between forest and edge during this period in late June, which is really a key time because whippoorwills are either incubating eggs or provisioning their nestlings at this time. So they really need a lot of food in order to maintain their reproductive success. So forests are especially important during that period. We also see an interesting interaction between moon score and habitat and its effect on average moth weight. So as moon score increases, we see that moth weight increases in forests and decreases along edges on average, which suggests that those heavier moths, heavier species, might be actually shifting their activity more towards forests during brightly moonlit nights, potentially as a defensive response to predation by whippoorwills and other insectivores that are active in open areas. So just to kind of summarize those spatial patterns really quickly, as I mentioned, high abundance in biomass relative to edges shows the importance of forests for moths, particularly during that late June, early July period when whippoorwills are in key reproductive stages. And then heavier moths may shift into forests in a defensive response to moonlight to avoid predation of whippoorwills. Now I want to go through a few spatial patterns. Here's the interaction between moon score and time of night. And we can see that there's a decline at dusk and midnight in association with increasing moon score, but that trend is actually bucked by the before dawn time period, when the amount of moths and the biomass of moths both increased as moon score got brighter, which is surprising because generally when you're using light traps, you expect the captures to go down as moon score gets brighter, since the ambient environment is brighter and the traps are less attractive to moths. But this suggests that there might be some response, a positive response to moon score in terms of moth activity before dawn, which is really interesting. We also have the mass of an individual moth as related to sampling round and time of night. So as you can see, early in the season, we actually see the heaviest moths on average are active later in the evening at midnight and before dawn. But after dusk, the average mass of a moth actually peaks in that June time block, again, that critical period when whippoorwills are provisioning their young. And then lastly, I wanted to show this interaction between time of night and sampling round for the biomass of moths, which shows again that peak in biomass is during that critical late June period, specifically after dusk, when biomass is the highest for moths. So just to round up those temporal patterns really quickly, as you can see, moth biomass and mean weight both peak at dusk between late June and early July, highlighting the importance of that brief window for whippoorwills. And also whippoorwills likely benefit from greater moonlight availability in late May and early June, when greater biomass and heavier moths are available later in the evening. So whippoorwills benefit from being able to forage later for longer with brighter moonlight. And moonlight also might be increasing the abundance of large moths before dawn, which would further benefit whippoorwills that were foraging later into the night. So the conclusions that we can draw from some of these patterns are that moth preferences for forests during key periods might actually imply that they're avoiding foraging whippoorwills at our sites. So those heavier moths moving into forests with brighter moonlight, or moths moving to forests during that key period when whippoorwills really need to provision their young, could imply that moths might be having some sort of defensive response to whippoorwills. In order to benefit whippoorwills, land managers should prioritize forests with open canopies or clearings to increase foraging opportunities for whippoorwills who need light and space to hunt. And they should minimize disturbances such as artificial light or other human activities during those key times of night and key times of year when moth activity is highest, in order to help land managers conserve those interactions between moths and their ecosystems. With that, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for listening. Thank you to my advisors and my lab mates, my field technicians, lab technicians, and our funding sources. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that presentation, Grant. Grant is available to answer questions. However, looking at our time, he has indicated that he's willing to respond to questions in the chat. So certainly encourage you to ask some questions, but we are going to move into our next presentation. Our second presentation of the day is presented by Diego Evangelista Vargas of the Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos in Peru. And the presentation is titled Nesting Behavior of, excuse me, of Chordeiles Nightjar on central coast of Peru. And we will start that for you in a moment.
Hello, I am Diego Evangelista Vargas, from the Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos of Lima, Peru, and me with Professor Carlos Mendoza and our teamwork of students Shanelia Grada Barreto, Diana Ignacio, Adriana Salinas, David Crisanto Valladolid, Isabela Febres, and Jacqueline Collins, and also with Tiago Vernaschi Costa, a professor from the Universidade Federal de Itajuba from Brazil. We worked on nesting behavior of Chordeiles Nightjar, Cistelura decusata on central coast of Peru for the Global Nightjar Network virtual conference. Well, as introduction, we can see adult individual hatching, well, incubating an egg, and well, this work took place at Huaca San Marcos. This is an archaeological monument in Lima, Peru, in the coast of Peru. And this is a pre-Hispanic remain of the Lima culture from the ancients of Lima. And this is an area in the center of the Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos, university from Peru. And this is the location in Lima, in the coast of Peru. And this is an archaeological area. The Huaca San Marcos is significantly impacted by human traffic. It's a place that is not well protected by the university and the culture ministry. Yeah, and is located in the area of the university here, and it's on the middle of the city of Lima. Well, in this place, despite being an area significantly impacted by human traffic, an adult individual of Chordeiles Nightjar was found incubating an egg. This is a photo on August 17th of this individual incubating an egg. And this is the distribution of the species, found along the western Peru and extreme north of Chile. This species is considered by the UCN red list and on the category of less concern. And the objectives of our work is to observe and document the behavior of the Nightjar during its nesting phase, including the incubation, hatching, and parental behavior, collect data on egg measurements during the nesting, and monitor the growth of the chick, taking morphometric measurements, include weight and length of tail, wing, beak. Well, in our methodology, this study was located in Lima, the coastal desert of Peru, and it took place in 3 or 4 different points of the Huaca area. Well, for the materials, we used a photography application with coordinates, camera, ruler, caliper, laptop, and a trail camera. Well, for the results, the egg was found in an elevated area of the Huaca on August 17th of this year, and exactly 6 days later, on August 23rd, the camera trap monitoring was initiated. There is no precise date for the moment of the egg lying. We found the adult with the egg. Well, the eggs were laid on the ground without building any type of nest, in solitary places without vegetation, and it was only one egg, creamy white color. Well, this is an important information because we can see the biparental care, and it was only observed in the incubation stage, in which it is observed in the GIF that both parents are present. However, it is not possible to distinguish which is the female or which is the male, but is a small relay, but a small relay is observed between both parents. We can see here how the parent returns to take the place of the previous one who left. Well, in this video, the parent can be seen grooming itself while incubating the egg. This is the 26th of August during the day, and it's possible to observe the parent incubating the egg. Well, typical behaviors in incubation can be observed, including the rotation of the egg to distribute temperature evenly. Well, and this is the last video in which the egg is seen intact. Their hatching happens an hour later. Well, it would take place 8 days after the egg was found. Well, there is no visual record of the hatching moment, but the camera trap make it able to observe the moment when the chick has already emerged. We can see here the chick. This is 11 o'clock in the morning, the moment in the chick was hatched. Oh, we can see the chick here. Well, in the first days of the chick, we can, well, this is the night, 10 hours after the hatch. We can see the chick and the rest of the egg in the nest, and there is the parent taking care of him. One important information is that in less than 28 hours, the chick could slowly move around this birthplace. This is the 2 days after the hatch. Well, days after that is prior to feeding the chick, and we can see a small game between the parent and the chick. When the parent moves away from the chick, mating is chase him to get the food. This is the 10th of September. Well, once the chick has reached the parent, it stops being a small fight to get the food of the parent's mouth until the chick gets it. The parent guides the chick out of the nest. They walk in this small area of the nest, moving out of the range of the camera trap. And this is the 16th of September, and there is no sign of return of either of the individuals. This is the last time when we see the chick on the nest. And after that, it was recorded in 4 different locations within a 20 meters radius. Well, this is the growth process. We take measurements of the chick in 7 times. We take the weight, the length of the beak, the width, the depth, and the length, width, and tail length. Well, this is the weight variation between the data of the different days. We can see here the molting process in 3 different dates, and we can see how the feeders are ground. And well, this is the last day when we captured him. This is the 26th of September. This is the last day when we seen the chick, and the last day when we take the measurements of him. This is the 7th time that we caught them, and it was very difficult to call them to take the measurements. We captured him on our 4th attempt. It was very difficult. And well, this is the size with dorsal view, ventral view, and this is the total length of the individual on the last day. As a conclusions, we can say that Cisteria decusata exhibits an incubation period of approximately 9 days. Furthermore, this species demonstrates biparental care. When morphometrics measurements were taken of the chick, the female or the parent displayed defensive behaviors of this. Remarkably, the chick's molting process transpired rapidly, with the initiation of feeders change occurring just 9 days after hatching. And we can see the significant increase in weight of the chick. From the day of the hatching to the last day that we can see the chick, it takes only 1 month exactly. And this data represent the first detailed observations of the nesting behavior of its range restricted and poorly known species. Well, thank you for your attention, and thank you for my teamwork to help to take this important data for this species. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that fantastic presentation, Diago. It really demonstrates the high value observational data we can get with remote monitoring. Diago has indicated that he is here and available to answer questions. I'd encourage you to use the chat for that. Continue to use the chat just to keep us on time with our agenda. So thank you again, Diago, and yes, please make use of the chat.
Thank you. Sorry for my bad English.
Not at all. No apology necessary. It was excellent. Thank you. All right, we will head into our third presentation of the day. Our third presentation is presented by Rune van den Eind, master's student at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. And the presentation is titled Investigating the White Tail and Wing Markings of Male European Nightjars and Their Potential Role as Signals of Mate Quality. And note, this is a shorter presentation, so yeah, if you want to have those questions ready, please feel free to put them into the chat. All right, thanks. We'll start that in a moment.
Hello everyone, my talk will focus on the white tail and wing markings of male European nightjars and their potential role as signals of mate quality. Avian secondary sexual traits play an important role in mating interactions between potential partners. With this study, we aim to determine whether or not the whitetail and wing markings of male European nightjars fulfill such a quality signaling role, and subsequently if they are subjected to the resulting sexual selection pressure. As you can see on these images, the white markings are present on the 3 outermost wing primaries and the 2 outermost tail rectrices, and our first goal was to determine the size of these markings. From 2010 to 2019, ornament size was determined directly in the field. The size of the marking on wing primary P8 was determined by manually measuring the height and width of the marking and multiplying these to obtain the surface area. For the markings on the tail rectrices, only the height was measured, and this was done for 375 birds. From 2019 to 2021, ornament size was determined using the program ImageJ, and this allowed us to obtain more accurate surface areas. This method was used for 333 birds. In this graph, we see that the markings on P9 and T5 appear to be, on average, slightly larger compared to the other wing and tail markings obtained with ImageJ. Another important observation is that the marking on P8 appears to be larger when determined manually compared to when ImageJ was used. This indicates that it might be better to focus on one method of size determination in the future. Next, the overall ornament size variability was determined. Our results show that the marking on T5 was less variable than the marking on T4. And additionally, we found that the marking on P8 was the most variable and the marking on P9 was the least variable of all wing markings. This low variability of ornament size on T5 and P9, coupled with their large size, could indicate an important role in mate choice. However, further research needs to be performed. Lastly, ornament size variability was compared to that of specific biometric data indicated in black. Our results show that the between individual ornament size variation exceeds that of the biometric data, indicating that the markings were likely subjected to sexual selection. We are currently working on the methods to evaluate the honesty of the mate quality signal. We would like to correlate the surface area or length of the white marking, the body condition, age and breeding status of the nightjars, as well as with the year in which they were captured. Now all that's left for me to do is to thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Okay, and yes, so Rune is here. We would encourage you to reach out. Thank you very much for your presentation, Rune, by the way.
No problem.
Please reach out and use the utilize the chat. We're humming along today, so yes.
Yeah.
If you're up to that, or respond to some of those questions right in the chat.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we are going to head into our final presentation of session 4. This presentation is presented by Ash McDonald. They are affiliated with SUNY Brockport in the United States, and the presentation is titled Eastern Whippoorwill Nest Selection and Survival in Northern New York. We'll start that for you in just a moment.
This presentation is on Eastern Whippoorwill nest site selection and survival in Northern New York. I am Ash McDonald, a master's student at SUNY Brockport, and I've been working on this project with my advisors Dr. Jacob Straub and Dr. Kristen Malone, along with Dr. Matt Palumbo from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. The main objectives of this portion of our project are to determine the silvicultural practices and forest stand characteristics that influence nest site selection and nest survival of breeding eastern whippoorwills in New York. And then we will take that information to inform forestry best management practices for them in the state. For an overview of eastern whippoorwills in New York, they are part of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation's Young Forest Initiative, which seeks to increase and improve habitat for species that occur in 0 to 20-year-old forests, such as early seral and forest edge species. This focus includes whippoorwills, along with other birds like American woodcock and golden-winged warblers. One of the known areas with abundant whippoorwills in New York are the rock-barren regions in the northern part of the state. Whippoorwills have been designated as a species of special concern in New York. As you can see in these two maps from two previous breeding bird atlases, whippoorwills are declining. The decline in New York and its neighboring states and provinces was about 3.58% per year during this period. Quite a few of the populations in western New York and around the Adirondack Mountains in the north have disappeared. Thus, it is important for the conservation of the species to support the current populations and potentially regain the lost ones in the state. The study area for this project is in Jefferson County in northern New York, one of the more abundant remaining whippoorwill populations. We had 3 different study sites. One of them was Ashland Flats Wildlife Management Area, which is managed for grasslands, shrublands, and young forests. It was selected due to the recorded presence of whippoorwills along its Nightjar survey network route. The other 2 sites were neighboring Nature Conservancy properties that we knew had whippoorwill populations based on eBird data. As part of our project focuses on more fine-scale resource use, we decided to do a telemetry study with our whippoorwills. During the 2023 field season, we caught 18 whippoorwills. 14 of them were after second-year males, 3 were second-year males, and 1 was a second-year female. We trapped them with mist nets paired with audio lures and visual decoys, which is why we had such a high instance of males. We put small low-tech picopip transmitters on 16 of our birds, 15 males and 1 female. These are standard VHF radio transmitters with unique frequencies for each individual. Ultimately, we only tracked the 15 males after the female's signal was lost. After tracking our birds for the full breeding season, ending the first or second week of August, we were able to map out their individual home ranges. The average home range was 5.73 hectares, ranging from 1.2 to 12.5. This is within previously reported home range sizes, although slightly on the smaller side. As you can see here, the Nature Conservancy properties had dense populations, with non-tracked whippoorwills also in the area. At the Ashland Flats Wildlife Management Area, there were only 3 whippoorwills that spent a significant amount of time within the property boundaries. Only 1 spent all of its time on the property. Despite the area being managed specifically for young forest and shrubland, whippoorwills are not abundant there. For our project, we ultimately decided against using the standard nest searching protocol of searching for eyeshine along habitat edges. There were 2 main reasons for this. The first was that our sites were very shrubby, which made birds on the ground difficult to see. The second was that our habitat edges were not clearly defined on and around the rock barrens, which made it difficult to narrow down our search area. We did initially attempt the standard method, however, we did not have any success. Instead, we decided on a protocol that involved locating nests by tracking the male whippoorwills until they exchanged incubation duties with their mate after sunset. Our protocol was to first find the male while he was roosting, usually in the 10 to 20 minutes before sunset. Without disturbing him, we would stop nearby, angle our receiving antennas towards him, and wait for him to wake up and start moving. After he started moving, we would track him until we found a nest, or for at most an hour after sunset. As long as he was singing or actively moving, we stayed as far away as we could without losing track of him to limit disruption. Anytime he appeared to become stationary without singing, we moved in to get a visual confirmation on whether he was incubating or defensive of a nest. Anytime a male started moving again before we got a visual confirmation, We marked the approximate location to thoroughly check for eye shine and birds on the ground later in the night, and continued following the male. On the right here, you can see an example of about 5 different attempts to find a second nest for a whippoorwill. A summary of our efforts for these nest searches is that of the 13 nests we located using this method, we found 9 of them on the first try. Of the other 4 nests, we found 3 on the second try and 1 on the 5th try. While we were tracking the males, they almost always took over incubation or were otherwise near the nest about 20 to 40 minutes after sunset. Considering that they typically woke up 10 to 15 minutes after sunset, they took over incubation 5 to 30 minutes after they began their nightly activity. The tracker usually only had to spend about an hour or less tracking the male on any given successful night. After we located the nests, we aged them to estimate hatch and incubation dates. We decided to age the eggs with candling. I could not find any guide on how to age whippoorwill eggs in this fashion, so I based it off a chicken egg candling guide due to the similar incubation length. Anytime we were able to confirm a nest age later based on chick ages or data from our monitoring cameras, I rechecked the estimated incubation initiation dates. Our estimates based on the chicken egg guide were accurate. If we found nests during the chick stage or any time we had a visual confirmation on chicks during monitoring, we estimated their age based off their feather development stage. On the left, here's a chick that is just hatched, small and downy. In the middle are chicks that are about a week old with visible feathers growing in. And on the right are chicks that are about 17 days old when they are capable of flight. At this point, they have most of their feathers, though their tails are still growing in and are quite short. Because they do start flying around 15 days of age, we counted 15 days as our successful fledge date. I'm working on consolidating all the photos I took of both egg candling and chick feathers during the past season into more accurate aging charts for our technicians next year as well as in the future. For an overview of the nests we located this year, we found 14 total. 8 of those 14 nests fledged, 3 were confirmed predations, 1 failed to develop, and 2 had unknown causes of failure. We confirmed the egg that failed to develop through camera monitoring and candling it again after the parents abandoned the nest. The 2 nests with unknown causes of failure had older chicks that moved outside of our monitoring camera views before disappearing. Our nests had a 98.5% daily survival estimated from the Knoll model. This is within the range of previous literature, but on the high side. This is a good sign for these rock-barren populations of whippoorwills in northern New York, indicating that they can support successful breeding populations through the 15-day post-hatch period. Of our confirmed nest predations, 2 of them were by opossums. The third one was by a white-tailed deer. You can see the sequence of events of the deer predation in this nest camera footage. The female flushes off the nest in the back and then attempts to defend against the deer. This entire sequence took about 6 minutes. I have seen other reports of deer nest predations, so while I was initially a bit surprised, this is not unheard of. Our nests were placed in a wide range of environments. Some were on forest edges, some were out in the shrublands, and some were fully in the forests. In addition, some were placed in areas with dense shrubs, while others were placed in areas with very minimal shrubs. This includes one nest that was placed in a managed area of Ashland Flats that had very recently had shrub removal done. At each nest site and 2 paired random points, we conducted vegetation surveys based off methods often used for common nighthawks and used in a whippoorwill study in Ontario rock barrens. This included a nest visual obstruction percentage, ground cover, shrub cover, and tree cover percentages, tree and shrub heights, tree DBH, and canopy cover. Our nest analysis is in its preliminary stages, so we do not have many results yet. However, our birds do nest in areas with high eastern white cedar tree cover. This is a graph of the average cover for our 7 most abundant tree species at our points. The most abundant was invasive common buckthorn, and the second most abundant was eastern white cedar. As you can see, the white cedar has the greatest difference in cover between the nests and random points. It also has the highest average tree cover overall for the nests. I found this surprising, as whippoorwill nests have previously been largely associated with deciduous trees. This presentation covered only the first of our 2 field seasons. Next year, during our second field season, we hope to catch 20 more males. We also hope to find at least 16 more nests to bring our total to a minimum of 30. We will also continue our analysis into what factors might affect either daily nest survival or nest selection for whippoorwills in northern New York. After our analysis is complete, we will recommend forest best management practices to the New York Department of Environmental Conservation for breeding whippoorwills. I would like to thank everybody who helped me in the field, including my technicians, fellow grad students, and advisors. Of course, I would also like to thank our supporters and funders. Please let me know if you have any questions.
Okay, so we finally have enough time to allow for a couple live questions here, and Ash has indicated that they are available. Thank you very much for your presentation, Ash. We should talk. There's a lot of similarities between the work that we're doing here in Maine. But I did see some questions. Let me grab that for you. So Alicia asked, do you have any idea of trends in opossum or deer populations in New York State? I'm wondering if predator trends have any influence on the declining whippoorwill populations.
So I don't know the specifics on the trends for either species. White-tailed deer, if you go on a longer scale, have been increasing since the mid-1900s. However, at the moment, they're quite overabundant, and there's more actually concern with decreasing the populations of deer. So they're everywhere. So, but I don't know the actual current trends for either species.
And then you had one other question. So that was from Mark. Did they stay with parents for periods after fledging, like Lucy found with European nightjar?
So yes, they did. We noticed, especially with first nests of the season, the male would take over brooding duties when they started moving around and flying. So we were tracking the males all the time. So we often ran into the males or occasionally the females with the chicks after that date. They weren't necessarily near their nest though. So I think the latest was somewhere around 25 days old was the last time we saw chicks with a parent. Doesn't mean they're not there with the parents otherwise, but when they were with the males, we actually found them quite frequently after that date.
Great. Well, thanks again very much for your presentation, and you are continuing to get questions in the chat. So please feel free to respond there. That concludes our first session of the day, session 4, and we are going to switch over to our plenary talk for the day. So our plenary for today is presented by Eliza Stein. Eliza Stein is a master's student at Louisiana State University studying common nighthawk in southeastern portions of their breeding range and non-breeding ranges. She uses molecular tools such as DNA metabarcoding to study diet, prey selection, and the effects of prescribed fire on nighthawk foraging and nesting habitat. And the title of the talk is Crossing the Americas with the Common Nighthawk, or Yvyja'u. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Understanding year-round ecology through international collaboration. So excited to welcome Eliza, and we will start that for you in just a moment.
Hello, everybody. My name is Eliza Stein. I'm really excited and honored to be talking to you all today about an ongoing project that I've been working on with a team of international researchers. So the title of my talk today is Crossing the Americas with the Common Nighthawk, or Yvyja'u Mi, or Chordeiles minor, Understanding Year-Round Ecology Through International Collaboration. So just a little background on the common nighthawk before we begin. Common nighthawks are neotropical Nearctic migrants. They are also aerial insectivores, meaning that they forage for insects while in flight. And their populations have declined by about 50% since 1970. And the aerial insectivore guild is actually one of the most rapidly declining guilds in North America. So Environment and Climate Change Canada has presented a multitude of hypothesized drivers of aerial insectivore declines, and these range from declines in aerial insect populations to habitat loss on the breeding, migration, and/or wintering grounds, and the list goes on and on. But what do all of these have in common? Well, all of these are stressors that nighthawks and other aerial insectivores face throughout their range at every habitat that they occupy. And for many species like the common nighthawk, this includes a good portion of the globe. So the question I'm posing today is, how do we synthesize our understanding of species ecology to promote conservation across habitats? Now, I'll be the first to point out that I'm coming to you as someone who's just defended my master's, so I'm not the most experienced person in the room, but I have learned a lot through my collaborations with international researchers the past several years, and I'm going to share with you all some things that we've discussed during that time. So first, I'll share some of our new insights into non-breeding ecology of common nighthawks. Then a bit from my master's thesis on prey selection during the breeding and non-breeding season. And finally, some lessons I've learned from my experience and my colleagues about approaching international collaboration. This project began when my collaborators began doing surveys of the various species of nightjars that occur in a small reserve in the very north of Argentina called Reserva Natural Rincón de Santa Maria. The reserve is in Corrientes province, and it sits on the banks of a reservoir that's fed by the Paraná River. So the primary species that my colleagues were interested in was the sickle-winged nightjar, or Eleothreptus anomalus, which is classified as vulnerable by the IUCN. But it proves a bit difficult to get funding for a species with a distribution size that looks like this, compared to the common nighthawk, whose range covers like a third of the globe. But Environment and Climate Change Canada has funding available for migratory species that occur in Canada, which allowed Proyecto Ataja Caminos to fund fieldwork that incorporates our migratory friend, the common nighthawk, which also happens to occur at high densities at Santa Maria. So while driving the dirt roads at night, capturing and banding nighthawks, my colleagues were able to also capture and band sickle-winged nightjars, thus expanding the impact of these grants. And after 6 years of studying common nighthawks at Santa Maria, we've just published a paper in the Journal of Field Ornithology on their non-breeding ecology. So from 2017 to 2022, we had 237 captures of 95 common nighthawks. 34% of birds captured in the early season were recaptured in the late season, which is evidence that these birds remained at Santa Maria from November through March. 31% were recaptured in the following season, and 33% were recaptured 2 seasons later. And this is a surprisingly high interannual recapture rate, especially given that studies on the breeding grounds in Canada have had pretty low recapture success for this species. Now, what these recapture rates opened the door to was for an opportunity to put archival GPS tags on nighthawks, because there was a high chance of recapturing them the following year. So most of you, if not all of you, are probably familiar with this awesome paper that Ellie Knight and her co-authors published on migratory connectivity for common nighthawks. And to overcome this challenge of recapturing nighthawks in the breeding grounds, these folks use GPS Argos satellite tags. But these tags are heavier than archival GPS tags, so the smaller nighthawk subspecies that occur in the southeastern US weren't able to carry them. So we hypothesized that nighthawks that were spending the non-breeding season as far south as Argentina were breeding in the southern US. So tagging nighthawks at Santa Maria could be a great way to fill this gap. And just when my colleagues Nestor and Olga were waiting to get those tags back, I joined the project as a volunteer in 2019. And I spent a few weeks with them and with Christina Cockle learning about the project. And from there, I decided to do a master's project with Sabrina Taylor at Louisiana State University on some aspect of Common Nighthawk ecology throughout their full annual cycle. But while we were waiting for those tags to come back, Nestor and Olga were going out pretty much every evening to study the non-breeding nighthawk ecology at Santa Maria. One thing that we spent a long time looking at was habitat use at daytime, dusk, and throughout the night using pinpoint GPS tags. During the day, we observed that the 6 individuals we tracked roosted communally in a stand of mature pine just south of the reservoir. And they were likely roosting on horizontal tree limbs like we've seen in the northern latitudes. This communal roosting is also supported by observations of several nighthawks leaving the same roost site to forage at dusk. During the foraging period immediately after sunset, nighthawks were entirely over grasslands and pine and eucalyptus stands. They were never over water, and this is quite different from some of the studies in Canada that saw nighthawks foraging primarily over bodies of water. Throughout the night, nighthawks occurred on dirt roads, rocky platforms next to the reservoir, and in areas with short grass. And these dirt roads and rocky platforms were also where we were capturing them, in addition to the gravel landing strip that you can see on the left with that pink dot. So eventually in 2020 and 2021, we recaptured 3 of the nighthawks that were carrying migration tags. So where did they go? Well, after leaving Santa Maria, at least 2 of these birds, maybe all 3, stopped over in Orinoco, Colombia for about a month. Interestingly, they were only 42 kilometers apart along a stretch of the same dirt road. We had 8 nighttime fixes from these birds that placed them resting in open grasslands, and we had 2 daytime fixes that showed them roosting in gallery forests, so similar habitat uses in Santa Maria. After Colombia, all 3 birds spent the breeding season in Florida in the United States, where 1 nested in a protected longleaf pine forest. 1 was actually at a suburban golf course and probably had a rooftop nest nearby. And the 3rd spent the breeding season in an urban mixed pine forest. Since these were all females, it's likely that they had at least 1, possibly even 2 nests in these spots. You can see in that top photo the 2 distinct clusters of yellow points, which are separated by about a month, and so that also supports this hypothesis that this bird had 2 nests. Now, after departing the breeding grounds, these nighthawks did not return immediately to Santa Maria, but they actually had what we're calling a first non-breeding site for about 3 months in the Cerrado region of Brazil. And we also saw a similar pattern in the Knight et al. Study that most birds had 2 distinct non-breeding areas. This is likely where the birds molted the majority of their primary feathers, and the habitat here was a mix of native scrub, gallery forests, and cultivated land. So what do we learn from this migration data? Well, we see the importance of the Cerrado region in Brazil for nighthawks throughout their range, both in our study and in previous migration studies. We also see more migratory connectivity for this population than Knight et al. Found for the more northern populations. And this suggests to us the possibility that nighthawks have some level of chain migration, whereby the more southerly breeding populations spend the non-breeding season farther south than the more northerly populations. We also saw that, like many other long-distance migrants, nighthawks spend more than 2/3 of their annual cycle outside of the breeding grounds. So that brings us back to some of the key points. So now that we have these new insights into non-breeding ecology, what do we do with them? How can we use them to synthesize our understanding to promote conservation? I'm going to give a couple of examples of the types of studies that this opens the door to. And this first one is actually what I did for my master's thesis over the past few years. So with our migration data, we were able to link one population between two sites during its annual cycle, the breeding grounds and one of the non-breeding grounds. We also gained a ton of information on foraging ecology in the non-breeding season, which was previously lacking. And this allowed us to study prey selection in both Florida and Argentina, which can provide really important insights into species vulnerability. So we know that extinction risk is a function of specialization, whereby higher diet specialization leads to higher vulnerability. But specialization isn't static, it's dynamic, even within one individual's lifetime. So we wanted to know, how does diet specialization or prey selection change throughout the year? So over the course of 2 years, we measured prey availability in both Citrus Wildlife Management Area, which is where one of our GPS-tagged nighthawks spent the breeding season, and Santa Maria. And actually, the first non-breeding season of the study happened to begin in December 2020, which meant that this was a no-no. So Nestor and Olga collected all of the samples at Santa Maria for the entire first season. We also sampled nighthawk diets, either by capturing them in mist nets or by spotlighting them on roads, and we collected a fecal sample. With that fecal sample, we used DNA metabarcoding to identify the insect prey that nighthawks had consumed. And just super briefly, this involves collecting a fecal sample, extracting DNA, amplifying the insect DNA with PCR, sequencing the DNA, and then matching the sequences to a reference library to assign taxonomic identities. So what did we find? We saw higher diet diversity at Santa Maria. So when we looked at Shannon Wiener diversity for the breeding population, we got an index value of close to 0, which indicates that nighthawks are eating about 1 prey order per meal. And you can see that visually in this figure here, where each bar represents an individual sample, most of them have just 1 color or 1 order. Whereas at Santa Maria, diet diversity was over 3-fold higher. You can see a much more colorful chart showing how many insect orders each nighthawk consumed in the previous meal. We also found no difference in overall insect diversity between the 2 sites, which suggests that this higher diet diversity reflected less prey selectivity in the non-breeding habitat. And I'm just going to highlight a few things here. So this shows all of the prey orders that nighthawk consumed at Citrus on the left and at Santa Maria on the right. We can see the black bars, which indicate the expected number of prey detections in the fecal samples based on our prey availability samples. And the colored dots are the actual detections of that prey in the fecal samples. So across the board, nighthawks preferred Odonata, Hymenoptera, and Hemiptera in both locations. These are the dragonflies and damselflies, ants and wasps and bees, but pretty much just flying ants were what we saw, and true bugs. And they avoided small Coleoptera in both locations. This is actually different from what we expected based on a breeding population in Canada, which exhibited an inordinate fondness for beetles. And something really interesting that we found was that nighthawks avoided Lepidoptera in the breeding season, but preferred them by a really big margin in the non-breeding season. So what we think is that these breeding nighthawks were capturing Lepidoptera, but instead of consuming them themselves, they were passing them off to their young. We also collected 3 food boluses from breeding nighthawks, and 2 of them contained moths. So what can we conclude from this study? Nighthawks have a more diverse diet in their non-breeding habitat, which we believe to be the result of less selectivity. We also saw that nighthawks showed a year-round preference for Hymenoptera and Hemiptera, and a year-round avoidance of small Coleoptera. And this really highlights that nighthawks may be less vulnerable to changes in prey communities in the non-breeding grounds, but they are still vulnerable because they do show selection for certain prey groups, even in the non-breeding season. And this becomes really important when we look at where nighthawks are spending their non-breeding seasons. Many of these sites are surrounded by cultivated land and especially susceptible to habitat loss and pesticides. But through studies like these, we can identify which prey groups are important for birds like nighthawks, and then figure out how we can protect these prey populations. And this brings us to the final point that I'm going to discuss today, which is the role of international collaboration in creating this synthesized understanding that promotes conservation across habitats. So tag-based studies are really cool. They can give us a ton of information without us as researchers having to travel long distances and follow these birds on foot through the Cerrado to figure out where they're going. But so much of the information that rounds out the picture is collected through research on the ground. And I've just made a map of the on-the-ground research that I know of for common nighthawks. There are a lot of gaps you can see outside of the breeding grounds, and this is true for so many other species. One of the major things that's responsible for these gaps is the disparity in resources, particularly between the global north and the global south. So let's look at the common nighthawk versus the sickle-winged nightjar. The common nighthawk has a super broad distribution, and it's a species of least concern. The sickle-winged nightjar, on the other hand, has a small distribution. It's extremely limited in where it's found, and it's listed as vulnerable from the IUCN. So let me ask you, which is easier to get research funding for? Ding, 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 it's the nighthawk. Actually, we've gotten about 30 times more funding for nighthawks than for sickle-winged nightjars. And that's because even though nighthawks are a species of least concern, they occur in North America, and this is where most of the research funding comes from right now. But something great is that we can use this funding to purchase supplies and equipment that can be used again and again and again. So for example, the pinpoint GPS tags that Proyecto Ataja Caminos got for common nighthawks can continue to be used for other nightjar species. And we see this with tags a lot, that they're used multiple times. Same with things like transportation and lodging. If we're purchasing gas using funding for common nighthawk research, we'll study a few more species of nightjar as well while driving that circuit, capturing nighthawks. And equipment like malaise traps can be used again and again for multiple projects. But the biggest thing is habitat restoration. So most of the funding for Proyecto Ataja Caminos comes from Environment and Climate Change Canada, and it's directed toward habitat conservation for migratory birds. But resident species, we know, like the sickle-winged nightjar, are benefiting hugely from this, maybe even more so than nighthawks because of their specialized habitat needs. But things like this require some creativity to maximize the potential of these resources. Can we find the common nighthawk in other areas that organizations are excited to fund and that allow for the simultaneous study and protection of other species? This also requires that funding sources in the global north have a bit more flexibility when funding projects in the global south, especially with things like funding matching that make it really difficult for small organizations to get larger grants. So a couple more examples of awesome ways that we've been able to collaborate to stretch the impacts of our common nighthawk research to benefit other species. Early in 2022, we had an entomologist, Gaston Zuberan, collaborate with us on identifying some insects collected at Santa Maria for the Nighthawk project. And while there, he also identified insects in stomach samples from sickle-winged nightjars, and Nestor Farinha has a paper in review right now that presents those results. It appears that it might actually be the sickle-winged nightjar with the inordinate fondness for beetles. And also when we shipped the nighthawk fecal samples to the US, we shipped some sickle-winged nightjar fecal samples, which we're going to be doing some barcoding on as well to supplement the stomach samples. Now I'm going to wrap up here by attempting to answer this question. How do we synthesize our understanding of species ecology to promote conservation across habitats? How do we do this? Certainly with difficulty. This is a hard task that our global community has been working on for a long time, but we are making progress. Also with humility. Researchers coming from high-income countries in the global north, like myself, must learn about how to work equitably with researchers in the regions of study if they're outside of our home countries. And finally, with creativity. And I'm really excited to be here at the Global Nightjar Network Conference because it's events like these that give us our best shot at putting some great minds together to think creatively about issues that affect species all across the globe. And with that, I would like to thank you. Here's a citation for this recent paper on non-breeding ecology of common nighthawks. And I welcome any questions either now at the conference, or you can find my email there. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that presentation, Eliza. It was fantastic. It's really great to see some of the ways that you have been able to overcome some of those disparities and use use your resources in a creative way. I think that's really exciting. Eliza has said that she is available to answer questions. She's here, so we've got a few minutes. So please do put those questions in the chat if you've got questions, and we will answer them here. I'll give people just a moment longer if they want to ask questions. Otherwise, you're getting some support here. A remarkable example of the cooperation of the Pan American team. Absolutely. Okay, so if there, we have a Ruben has a noob question. He says, is there a difference between foraging tactic between both species? Is that something that you observed?
Yeah, I would say that's not a noob question. That's a really good question and has been difficult to answer, but yeah, totally. Common nighthawks use more of a hawking flight. They'll fly oftentimes at much higher altitudes than seagoing nightjars to forage. They also are really limited to that dawn and dusk period, and we barely ever see nighthawks foraging in the middle of the night, even when moonlight is readily available. And that's different from a lot of nightjars, especially seagoing nightjars, which will forage at night in addition to the crepuscular period. And the seagoing nightjars will make more low-flying stallying flights where they'll rest on the road and kind of leap up for a short flight to capture insects from there.
All right, and we got another question here from Alicia. So, have you been using MODIS for Pan-American nighthawk tracking in your study area?
Yes, we have. We just built a MODIS tower actually at Santa Maria last year, which is really exciting. And Yvyja'u started putting out some nano tags on common nighthawks. So we have yet to get some of that migration data back, but it's in the works.
Awesome. Congratulations on the new tower. That's super exciting. I have a question for you. So you spoke on the two separate wintering sites. Did you notice any habitat differences in terms of composition between your first wintering site and that secondary wintering site?
Yeah, so the first one being in Colombia and the second one being in Brazil. I mean, they're both kind of like tropical savanna ecosystems, and the nighthawks are using similar, microhabitat characteristics, even though they're occupying really different larger scale habitats. So even just, comparing the longleaf forest in Florida to the grasslands in Santa Maria in northern Argentina, these are super different ecosystems, but still nighthawks, they're resting and nesting on bare patches of ground, looking for that short grass, shrubs. A couple people have talked in this conference about the importance of some vegetation and shrubs for predator defense, and we also see that as being really important in all of the habitats they're in.
Great, thank you very much. So we have another question here. How can we encourage folks from the global north to donate items? Is there a resource or website that we can point folks to facilitate this?
Yeah, that's a good question. Proyecto Ataja Caminos does have a website that I'll throw in the chat after this. But I think, more so than just this project specifically, I like looking really, it takes a huge effort on our part as researchers from the global north to spend that extra energy finding researchers that are outside of the country that we live in who are also studying similar systems that might be able to use our resources. And a lot of times that requires crossing the language barrier, which can be scary and difficult. That was a super scary and big challenge for me too. But taking that leap, especially since we have those resources, is huge for that. But yeah, thanks for the question. I'll put the link to our website in the chat.
Great. Oh yeah, and Maria just says, I'll just read this off, but perhaps we can create a resource like this on the Global Nightjar Network website. I think that's a really excellent idea. If folks are interested in this, please add this to the feedback forms. Yeah, I think that's really a great idea. A question here from Gabriel. You mentioned, sorry, it's jumping away from me. You mentioned that common nighthawks seem to show a chain migration pattern, which is rather unusual. Have you explored that further or have any idea about what causes this? Do you know any other species in the Americas that show chain migration pattern?
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is no. The migration study was really spearheaded by Nestor Fariña and Olga Villalba and Christina Cockle. So they would be your experts on that. And I think their emails are probably in the program and some of them are on here now. But also, yeah, I mean, so this is really fresh information that we've just gotten back. We were expecting to find more population mixing on the non-breeding grounds, like a lot of these other studies have had. So this is a surprise that we're just kind of starting to dip our toes in. And I would encourage you to check out that paper, which has a little bit more information on that too. But yeah, I'm not your expert on that, but I do appreciate the question.
Great. Well, thank you very much again. This I think has stirred a lot of ideas and thoughts with many of our participants, and hopefully some of these discussions can continue during our discussion periods. You've touched on a lot of really important stuff within this. So thanks again for your presentation. And yeah, please feel free to continue to ask questions in the chat. We are going to head into our break period here. Before we do so, I just want to reshare some information. So we are going to have some discussions at the end of the day, and we did have some excellent poster submissions. So if you'd like to view those posters and write questions, make any comments during the break period, I'd certainly encourage you to do so. And we will have some discussion period to talk about those posters towards the end of our agenda today. As we head into the break, we'll return at 1740 and head into session 5 on breeding and conservation. Thanks again to the presenters this morning. And thanks again to Eliza for that really excellent plenary. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully people had a chance to stretch their legs for a minute. We're gonna head into our next session. And in doing so, I'm going to hand over my hosting duties to another member of our steering committee. So we're gonna have Ruben Evans will host for the rest of the day. Thank you guys very much for everything this morning, and looking forward to talking to you and seeing the rest of the presentations. So over to you, Ruben.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ruben. So before we start with the session on breeding and conservation, I would like to encourage everyone to continue posting questions to the chat. I think you're doing a great job today, so please keep up the good work. Some very brief informations about the chat. There is still our code of conduct. You can also find the feedback form. There is still the links to merchandise and to donate for the small grant programs. Especially think about the previous plenary about the Global South that we might be able to support with some equipment or something. And then there is still the link to the Padlet where you can find the very nice Nightjar posters. Okay, so now for the 5th session on breeding and conservation, we would like to start with Joshua Driscoll. He's a master's student at the University of Massachusetts in the USA. And he will tell us more about examining habitat selection of eastern whippoorwills on a managed pine oak barrens in the northeast of the United States. The presentation will start now.
All right, hopefully I've already done a quick introduction, but if not, I am Joshua Driscoll, and I am stoked to be here to talk to you about the breeding ground habitat selection by our eastern whippoorwill at Montague Plains Wildlife Management Area in Massachusetts. So the eastern whippoorwill is distributed across the eastern United States, as you can see there, but like many of our nightjars, they have been declining in recent decades. And you can see that in the results of a breeding bird atlas, 2 breeding bird atlases completed in Massachusetts, the first in the 1970s and the latter in the early 2000s. As you can see in the early 2000s, they were eliminated from about half of the area that they were previously detected in the 1970s. Our study area, Montague Plains, is a heavily managed wildlife management area that is managed with prescribed burns, herbicide applications, and mechanical clearings. And what we are using to study these birds out at this pine oak barren is a cellular tracking technologies automated radio telemetry system, which consists of about 80 of nodes that are deployed across a 4 square kilometer area. And what is hopefully happening is a tag is sending out a ping that is then detected by a node, and then the node collects the signal strength of that ping and sends it to the central sensor station. And here you can see our deployment area with each of those dots representing a node placed about 200 meters apart, and that central teardrop representing the sensor station. And each one of our nodes is deployed on top of an 8-foot tall conduit pole. Our field methods included capture of our individuals, maintenance of our node grid, which included updating of some hardware values, calibration of our nodes, and as well as some nocturnal point counts and vegetation structure analysis to go along with the telemetry information that we would be getting. Our analysis methods included triangulation of a ping position. So as a ping reached out to a node and the node collected a signal strength, we then triangulated that tag's position based on at least 3 node detections, and then a drawing of a home range for each individual. And here you can see the results of our triangulation analysis. And this is from when we put the tag on till about mid-July. And this is 11 of our males in 2022. And this is about 330,000 points with some pretty strict distance filters on it. And that averages to about 30,000 points per bird. And then moving on to our home range analysis, while I wasn't able to finish all of our birds for this meeting, you can see from 5 here that our estimate is about 57 hectares for a 95% kernel density estimate and about 10 hectares for our 50% kernel density estimate. And what are we doing next? We're looking to incorporate that vegetation structure analysis that we did, as well as other habitat variables to write a resource selection function for our study system. And we are also looking to occupancy modeling of our point count data. And quickly, I would like to thank the people and organizations listed here, and I will now take any questions.
All right. Thank you, Joshua, for this incredible data set to show us this incredible data set.
Thank you.
I'm afraid that we don't have a lot of time for questions, so maybe one quick question, and then we can move to the next speaker. Okay, I propose that you answer the questions in the chat, and then we can move to the next speaker.
All right, sounds good.
So yeah, thanks a lot. So the next speaker is Natalie Ramos. She's a master's student at the University of Georgia in the USA, and she's going to talk about breeding and post-breeding resource selection of a Chordeiles widow. The presentation will start shortly.
Hello everyone. Today I'll be talking about breeding and post-breeding resource selection for a Chordeiles widow we tagged in coastal Georgia in the southeastern United States. Chordeiles widows are the largest North American nightjar that breed in the woodlands of the southeast United States and winters in lowland forests. They're historically found near swamp edges, open pine and oak woods, and pine barriers. This bird spends most of the day resting on horizontal tree limbs or on the ground where its camouflage makes detecting difficult. Long-term monitoring data indicates that Chordeiles widow populations have declined by at least 69% since 1966, though the causes of these declines are not well understood. Their nocturnal and secretive nature have made it difficult to study the species, limiting answers to important habitat questions. Chordeiles widows are currently listed on the International Union Conservation and Nature Red List as near threatened. They're also included on the list of common birds in steep decline, which is a list of 24 birds that have lost more than 50% of their populations over the past 40 years. Not only do Chordeiles widows occur in low numbers over a limited distribution, but they're also subject to stochastic threats that are damaging to their current population status. Threats to this species include breeding and wintering habitat loss and degradation, urban development, and pesticide use, which potentially disrupt foraging and nesting behavior. Many species, including chucks, are also experiencing dramatic declines due to a decrease in food availability linked to climate change. Past research on breeding season point count surveys have provided estimates on the relative abundance of Chordeiles widows, as well as habitat selection during the breeding season, but the effects on landscape on habitat use outside of the breeding season remain poorly understood. Few studies done on the species have provided us with little knowledge about migration phenology, habitat use, and general population status. Our study aimed to fill knowledge gaps on migration phenology, timing, landscape, and habitat selection in chucks during both the breeding and winter season. During the summer of 2022, 6 adult Chordeiles widows were fitted with GPS tags attached using a wing loop harness constructed from elastic cord. Transmitters programmed with a conservative location fixed schedule, balanced data resolution, and transmitter longevity. These tags recorded daily locations at 12 p.m. for approximately 1 year, providing detailed information on migration timing, routes, and winter locations of tagged individuals. We recovered data from 1 functional tag, and location data stored on the tag were remotely downloaded using a low-tech pinpoint VHF commander, giving us 123 points to work with for our analysis. Using high-resolution GPS tracking data from 1 male Chordeiles widow that spent the breeding season at Altama in coastal Georgia, we provide the first description of migration behavior of this species. So this individual was tagged on June 10th, 2022, and he spent the next 61 days in his breeding territory. After breeding, he moved north and spent 59 days in a suburban rural mixed landscape, approximately 15 kilometers from the original breeding site. After this post-breeding period, the individual migrated through eastern Florida until settling in its wintering grounds in central Cuba on October 16, where it spent the next 128 days. It then followed a similar route back up to coastal Georgia in early March of 2023, where it spent the breeding season at its original breeding site. These data were collected on May 22nd of 2023. Since we caught this individual late during the breeding season and he spent the following breeding season in the same area, the 2 periods from 2022 and 2023 were combined for a total of 55 location data points. 48 locations were collected during the 2 months he spent in the post-breeding period. And because he migrated much later than anticipated, only 13 location points were collected in his wintering grounds. Habitat selection can often differ greatly from how habitats are used during periods of activity, such as foraging. And so we examined third-order habitat selection to characterize habitat usage by the individual during its stationary breeding, post-breeding, and wintering periods. We used a third-order resource selection function to perform our analysis. The RSF framework links the used distribution of an individual to a group of locations that were available to the individual to link their selection to specific habitat components within a boundary. We used an ESRI Sentinel-2 10-meter resolution land use dataset, which was the highest resolution available that was consistent across each of the stationary periods, as remote sensing datasets in Cuba are limited. This land cover dataset provided rangeland, flooded veg, cropland, water, built area, bare ground, and forest as land cover covariates to use in our analysis. We restricted our available points to be in the forest land cover class within a 2-kilometer buffer, as this was a reasonable distance the bird would be traveling during the day, when activity is relatively limited. Available daytime locations were placed randomly within forested habitats in this buffer at a ratio of 10 available locations to 1 used location. Distance to all available land cover types were calculated and used in our model, with the exception of forest habitats, as all daytime used points were located in the forest. Chuckwill's widows like to roost in mixed woodlands and forage along woodland edges and over adjacent open areas. So we hypothesized that he would select daytime roost sites based on proximity to foraging habitats. We hypothesized that insect availability would be relatively high in the rangeland, flooded vegetation, cropland, and water land cover classes. We predicted a negative relationship between habitat use and distance to these higher food availability habitats, meaning as distance increased from these habitats, usage would decrease. We hypothesized that there was a higher disturbance in built areas, as this land cover class was characterized by human-made and used roads and buildings. We predicted chucks would select alternative roost sites to minimize disturbance and not select to use these areas. And there would be a positive relationship, meaning as distance to built areas increased, chuck use would increase as well. Bare ground was defined as rocky, sandy areas with little to no vegetation, which we hypothesized would have little to no food availability. It's unclear whether or not chucks have use for this type of habitat, so we predicted there was no effect on distance to bare ground on chuck use. Results from the breeding season in coastal Georgia, reported with 95% confidence intervals, show that during this period, based on available locations across this landscape, this individual selected areas that were closer to cropland and flooded vegetation habitats, which were consistent with our hypothesis of use. However, it did not select to use areas near rangeland, water, built area, or bare ground habitats. Results from the post-breeding secondary period that was just 15 kilometers north of the breeding location showed that this individual used areas closer to cropland, built areas, and bare ground. And what's interesting about this area is it's a suburban rural mix. So the forest patch that the individual was using was relatively small compared to the breeding season and much closer to neighborhoods and rural development. It did not use areas near rangeland or water habitats, and there was no flooded vegetation within the 2-kilometer buffer. Results from the period located in central Cuba show that during the winter, this individual selected habitats closer to rangeland, water, and built areas, and showed no relationship with cropland based on available locations on the landscape. So something to point out when looking at all habitat selection across the annual cycle is that roosting habitat usage for Chuckwill's widows seems to vary greatly across each of these landscapes. While daytime roost locations take up a small proportion of an individual's home range, habitat selection during this period of low activity could possibly be related to nest success and survival. So perhaps this individual was selecting areas closer to foraging habitats during the breeding season to be able to provision its nestlings, and prey types may also differ across periods depending on resource needs when they're not nesting. During the breeding season, they might be balancing foraging against nest predation, and maybe disturbance is more of a concern during the breeding season. So the way individuals balance risk and disturbance versus foraging might be different during each of these seasons. So while we had a small sample size of 1, and it provided us with some information on habitat selection throughout the breeding, post-breeding, and wintering period, continued efforts to gather tracking data from more individuals will help improve our understanding of variability in migration and resource selection throughout the annual cycle. The individual that we tagged wintered in Cuba, which greatly limits the remote data sets that we can use in our analysis. Forested habitats are much more complex than using a simple forest covariate, so we plan to use more detailed land cover data sets for the breeding and post-breeding period to better characterize what forest landscape features are being used. Last summer, in the summer of 2023, another male Chordeiles widow was fitted with a flicker cellular transmitter in Athens, Georgia. And even though Athens is only 280 miles from the coast, this bird used an entirely different migration route, one that did not include a post-breeding stationary period. So we're left wondering if this post-breeding stopover site is common amongst other chucks or even other nightjars. Common nighthawks and whippoorwills have greatly benefited from a collaborative effort of tracking and monitoring efforts with surveys, GPS tags, and audio recording units in the United States, and conservation efforts for Chordeiles widows could also benefit from a collaborative network like this, as their populations will continue to decline without it. Conservation efforts for Chordeiles widows across breeding and wintering ranges should prioritize surveying and managing areas with high insect availability, as well as further exploring daytime habitat selection and investigating the variability across multiple individuals. So with that, I wanted to thank the staff at Altama Wildlife Management Area where our trapping efforts took place, and the Georgia Ornithological Society, as well as our many other collaborators, because without their help, this project would not be possible. So thank you all very much for your time and interest. And with that, I can take any questions.
All right, thank you, Natalie. So Natalie is online and she's available for Q&A. So if there are any questions, please put them in the chat. So there is a question from Sarah. Whether the other 5 GPS tags were not recovered.
They were not. So we had 3 weeks over the summer where the tags were turning on that we can download the data. And unfortunately, the only bird that was recovered was that bird that we tagged in that first photo. So yeah, the other 5 were not. They might have been in the area, but you know, either the tags might have failed or the birds might have died.
Okay, and then there is a question from Michiel, and he's wondering whether you have an idea about the variation in home range size in different periods of the annual cycle.
So we've not currently calculated home range size across the periods, but that's definitely something that we're interested in. Again, we only have this one individual, but ideally we'd love to tag some more and see variation in home range size across these periods. Yeah.
All right, that will be very nice. So keep us posted on that.
Yeah.
So if there are any more questions for Natalie, then please put them in the chat. And then we can move on to our next speaker, who is Joelle Yvyja'u, and she's a research intern at the AP Leventis Ornithological Research Institute in Nigeria. And she's going to talk about protected areas and how they may be important for Nightjar conservation in an Afrotropical landscape. So the presentation will start in a few seconds. Voila.
Hi everyone, I am Yvyja'u with Hope, and I'll be presenting on protected areas being an important tool for Niger conservation in an Afrotropical landscape, Nigeria. So knowledge on the effects of land use on avian community is crucial for designing realistic conservation strategies, as land use is one of the global pressure affecting all forms of lives that alters the ecosystem structure and services and also leads to loss of biodiversity. Nigers and owls are among the poorly studied avian group in tropical Africa. Therefore, the aim of this work is to assess the importance of protected areas in conserving these species by comparing Niger richness across protection status. The study was carried out in Amrum Forest Reserve, which is an important bird and biodiversity area located in Plateau State, north central Nigeria. The reserve is surrounded by 3 communities, which are the Laminga, the Kerker, and Zarazum. The reserve consists of 3 habitat types, which are the gallery forest, the rocky outcrop, and the savanna. We generated 20 points across the study area, 10 points within the reserve, and 10 points outside the reserve. We ensured that points were at least 600 meters apart, and at each point we placed a Joule-like digital acoustic recorder to record bird calls from dusk to dawn. And we analyzed these recordings by transcribing the sonograms using the Audacity software. We recorded 5 species of Nigers, which are the standard-beaked Niger, the freckled Niger, the black-shouldered Niger, plain Niger, and the long-tailed Niger. And in comparing species richness across protection status, we found Niger richness to be higher in protected areas as compared to unprotected areas, which now gives us the conclusion that protected areas are actually important network for Niger species, as they comprises of complex mosaic of habitat types, which then provide the diverse habitats and niche requirements for this bird species. And we also conclude on the need for conservation education, as the mobility of bird ensures that these Niger species use both protected areas and its environs. Therefore, it's necessary for environmental awareness to be carried out to ensure that locals continue to aid the conservation of these species. I acknowledge the following people for their contribution to the success of this project. Thank you all for listening.
All right, thank you, Itma, for the very interesting presentation. I always like hearing stuff from research from Africa. I don't know if she is online. I can see her, but I don't know if she's available for Q&A for a quick question.
Oh, okay. Hi, Gabriel.
Yeah, yes, there she is. Hello.
All right. I think I'm available.
So if there is a quick question, then we can answer it. Okay, if not, then I propose to post the questions. There is a question from Richard. Sorry, Richard, I missed it. So he asks, do you plan to investigate the production of the calls of the recorded species throughout the night, and perhaps the entire breeding cycle?
Yes, we intend to do that. The work I just presented, it's a preliminary survey to the work which it's currently going on at the Nocturnal Avian Ecology Lab at PLENARY. So therefore, I think looking at the Nightjar sorry, looking at the production of calls throughout the night and breeding season, it's also one of the things we look at. And also, I didn't get to present that, but then part of the work, we also looked at the Nightjar richness and abundance across the time of the night. So, and in that result, we found Nigers here in Nigeria to be more active at dusk and dawn, which is hours from 6 p.m. to around 8 p.m. and also from 3 a.m. in the morning to 5 a.m.
All right. Thanks a lot for the answer. There's some more questions in the chat, so if you feel comfortable answering them, then please go ahead. With that, I would like to close the 5th session and open the 6th one on migration. And our first speaker is Carla Vanessa de Camargo Barbosa, and she's a biologist at the Sao Paulo State University in Brazil. And she's going to talk about the ocellated purwil, a migratory bird or subsampled. So the presentation will start in a few seconds.
Olá, meu nome é Carla, eu sou doutora em Zoologia pela Unesp de Rio Claro e atualmente estou terminando meu pós-doutorado pela mesma universidade. Eu trabalhei bastante com migração e me chamou a atenção dessa espécie, o bacurau ocelado, que algumas informações parecem desencontradas, então eu gostaria de falar um pouquinho sobre essa espécie hoje e colocar uma dúvida aí. Ela é uma ave migratória ou poderia ser uma ave subamostrada? Então, o bacurau ocelado, o Nyctiphilus ocellatus, é uma espécie que pode ser encontrada em diversos países da América do Sul e até mesmo Central, sendo que a sua área de distribuição, ela inclui a Mata Atlântica no Brasil e também na Argentina. A família Caprimugide, ela é conhecida por ter algumas espécies migratórias, como exemplo aí o Chordeiles minor, que já se sabe, né, que faz uma migração, mas nem todas as espécies a gente conhece muito bem, e é o caso do bacurau ocelado, que não se tem informações precisas sobre esse comportamento migratório, se ele é migratório ou não. Então, por isso, o objetivo dessa pesquisa foi tentar entender se o bacurau ocelado faz movimentos migratórios em regiões do sul e sudeste da América do Sul, focando, claro, em algumas áreas, algumas regiões, e por isso foram compiladas, então, informações das plataformas de ciência cidadã, o eBird e o Wikiaves, dos últimos 10 anos. Para Misiones, na Argentina, né, que foi utilizados os dados do eBird, e no Paraná e São Paulo, no Brasil, foram utilizados dados tanto do eBird e do Wikiaves, que é uma plataforma puramente brasileira, com dados apenas do Brasil. E ambas esses estados, né, essas regiões, são de Mata Atlântica. Então, como resultado, eu trago essa tabela e nós temos ali que os estados do Paraná, São Paulo, pelo Wikiaves, que é onde aparece aqui em um website, nós tivemos os registros principalmente no período reprodutivo para as aves da região, que seria de agosto a fevereiro. Em Misiones, as observações nesse período correspondem a 88%. Então, das 153 registros que temos apenas no eBird para a espécie, 134 foram em agosto, de agosto a fevereiro. E aí eu trago também, claro, outras datas, né, como abril e março, 4 registros, e agosto a fevereiro, 88%, então, dos dados. E aí, quando eu pego apenas pelo eBird, eu tenho lá dos 36 registros, 19 foram de agosto a fevereiro, e em São Paulo, dos 655 registros, 398 foram no período de agosto a fevereiro. Bom, os registros são claros que eles mostram, né, essa grande variância de dados, mas eu trago aqui, então, uma discussão que, claro, é esperado que ocorram mais registros durante o período reprodutivo, uma vez que as aves vocalizam mais, e isso facilita o registro pelos observadores de aves e pesquisadores. No entanto, mesmo se a gente considerar apenas os dados do Wikiaves, que nós pegamos apenas fotos e não vocalizações, né, que o site permite colocar tanto fotos como vocalizações, a gente percebe que em São Paulo 75% e 89% do Paraná, os dados são feitos nesse período reprodutivo. Então, esses valores podem indicar que a espécie ela é migrante austral parcial, porém, é importante avaliar quando os bacurais são espécies crípticas, passando despercebidas muitas vezes durante o período não reprodutivo. E por não vocalizarem, elas deixam assim de serem registradas pelos observadores de aves e pelos pesquisadores. Então, o que eu trago aqui é mais uma discussão para a gente pensar e rever a ideia de como que essas espécies elas podem sim ser migratórias e estão passando despercebidas, ou simplesmente é um viés amostral que ocorre para espécies como essa. Muito obrigada. Eu deixo aqui meu contato e obrigada.
All right. Thanks a lot, Carla. Carla is available with us, but to keep track of the schedule, I propose that the questions for Carla are posted in the chat, and then we can move to our next speaker, who is our committee member, Gabriel Norvik. He's a postdoc at the Lund University in Sweden, and he's going to talk about the spatial consistency and repeatability of migratory flight route and stationary sites of the European Nightjars. So his talk will start now.
Thank you for attending this presentation on the migration of European nightjars. Today we will explore how consistent European nightjars are in terms of space use in respect to the annual cycle, which is something I currently work on together with Susanne Åkesson and Anders Hedenström. So in other words, in this study we aim to track nightjars with GPS loggers over several years to learn to what degree these birds follow the same path and visit the same locations for breeding, wintering and migratory stopovers, and how the within individual variation in space use compared to the between individual variation of the study population. And the reason for doing so is to try to look at the journeys that nightjars take on every year to tease apart what is the result of internal factors such as experience from previous trips and genetically coded information about where, when and along which route to go, and where and when external factors such as foraging and flight conditions influence the outcome, which is the tracks that we record with our devices. And ever since we have been able to recognize individuals, it has been shown that migratory birds often return to the areas of birth or previous reproductive events, and to a certain degree also to their wintering grounds. More recently, tracking data on different species of nightjars, such as the European nightjar and the eastern whippoorwill, have shown that members of this group also show site faithfulness both to the natal reproductive areas as well as the main wintering grounds. Modern tracking techniques such as GPS loggers that sample the bird's position with a very high spatial resolution now allow us to look further into the details of the bird's consistency in space use between annual cycles. So for example, the maps here from the study of Beckermans and co-authors show how the estimated wintering home range of 8 eastern whippoorwills in 2 different years enclosed with yellow and white lines are centered on top of each other, illustrating a high wintering site fidelity of these birds. So, by measuring the within individual variation in space use, we quantify the degree of spatial consistency among the tracked individuals. That is, how far a track in a particular year is located from the track of the same bird in previous year. In addition to estimating degree of spatial consistency, this individual variation in space use can be contrasted against the between individual variation to provide a measure of repeatability, which is the relationship between the within and between individual variation in space of a population of interest. Under circumstances when the within individual variation is low, and thus individuals exhibit a high consistency, while the between individual variation is relatively high, most observed variation is due to the between individual variation, and the repeatability values approach its maximum. In contrast, if within individual variation is large, or if both within and between individual variation is relatively small, the repeatability value drops, while a consistency measure informs about if individuals return to the same site, area, or region every year. A repeatability measure shows how this relates to the variation observed in the population. This means that together these two measures may inform us about the migration patterns, to estimate the variation under which natural selection can act upon, where, when, and to what degree migrants show a spatial flexible response to external factors, and provide information on where populations may be sensitive for local pressures outside the breeding area. For this study, we have tracked European nightjars from the Swedish breeding population in Northern Europe, from which we previously have mapped the annual space use to illuminate the migration ecology and strategies. We now know that these birds are distributed across the southern tropical Africa during the winter, and that the autumn and spring migration routes results in narrow clockwise loop migrations. We also know that the extent of these loops, and hence the resulting detour, increases for populations west of Sweden, particularly so during the spring migration, something that could be explained by total migration costs if accounting for the large-scale wind patterns over the Saharan desert. Further, flight altitude recordings of European nightjars from Sweden show that they broadly follow the airflow of trade winds, concentrating at seasonally specific altitudes over the Saharan desert, which further indicates that these birds have a preference to migrate in tailwind conditions, if possible. The aims of this study were to map areas of relatively high spatial consistency in the annual cycle, and to quantify the repeatability of space use among the birds tracked from the Swedish breeding population. And based on previous studies on nightjars, we expect our birds to be faithful to the breeding and main non-breeding sites. But in contrast, given the previous associations that we've seen between bird routes and general airflow, and given that the birds likely show a relatively low specificity in habitat selection, we expect them to be rather flexible in route choice, and hence show low repeatability in migration routes. In other words, a large fraction of the total variation in migration routes will be due to a large within individual variation. For our analysis, we used GPS positioning data collected from the Swedish breeding birds from 2015 up to this summer. And each breeding season, we trapped territorial males within our study area using mist nets and playback to deploy or replace the devices on the back of the birds. For the GPS devices to last a full annual cycle, we program it to sample a maximum of 2 fixes per day. To date, we have tracks from 32 individuals covering at least parts of the autumn, and 24 spring tracks. For a subset of individuals, we have recorded additional seasons, and from this guide to the left here, we have managed to retrieve data from 4 autumns and 3 spring migrations. And this figure shows the raw data from this bird from 4 different breeding seasons represented by different colors, illustrating a consistent use of certain sites. And this is also apparent when calculating the nearest neighbor distance between positions from different years, which average about 300 meters, corresponding to the scale of a European nightjar territory. Likewise, the fidelity to the main wintering site was also high, with the nearest neighbor distance of about 100 meters among the birds, here illustrated by the same bird as before that returned to these 2 spots every winter. So our nightjars appear to show high consistency to the breeding and wintering sites, but what about the migratory routes? Well, here are the tracks for our birds, presented with the autumn to the right and the spring to the left. Different colors except for gray represent different individuals with multiple tracks. The bold blue one is the male from previous slides, showing 4 autumn tracks and 3 spring tracks. And the dashed lines roughly delineates the latitudinal extent of the barrier of the Mediterranean Sea and the Saharan Desert to aid orientation in the following slides. And just by inspecting the tracks, it becomes apparent that there are some degree of spatial sortings of tracks per individual, and that there are some seasonal differences in overall patterns of tracks, where the overall scatter seem to be more variable across latitudes in spring, and particularly so during the passage of the Saharan Desert and the Mediterranean Sea. This seasonal difference is also apparent when we summarize the longitudinal variation across latitudes. Here are graphs showing the total variation to the left, which is the variation among all tracks, and the variation between individuals when only including the mean track of each individual. And finally, to the right, the within individual variation, which is the spatial consistency in route choice. And for large parts of both autumn and spring migration, the within individual variation is notably smaller than the between individual variation, and we should therefore expect to find some degree of repeatability. Interestingly, both between and within individual variation peaks in association with the spring crossing of the Saharan Desert and the Mediterranean Sea, although while within individual variation increases during the barrier crossing and peaks at latitudes corresponding to the Mediterranean Sea, the between individual variation peaks before and after the crossing of the barrier. And a possible scenario that explains this may be that the nightjars follow genetically hardwired routes via specific longitudes in the Sahel zone at the initiation of the Sahara crossing, and then exhibit a migration tactic involving some degree of wind drift during the actual barrier crossing. So the two graphs to the right show the repeatability measure in route choice with 95% confidence interval, where a repeatability value towards 1 and a horizontal bar ending far from 0 indicates a high and significant repeatability in route choice among the nightjars. There are many details we could look into, but the overall pattern here is that the nightjars show a high repeatability both in autumn and spring south of the Saharan Desert as they spread out towards their individual wintering sites along individual routes, whereas the repeatability are lower further north and also non-significant in spring. And this is presumably due to less between individual variation closer to the breeding area, but also because of a larger within individual scatter in spring. Surprisingly, the autumn migration through Europe is also associated with relatively high repeatability values, indicating that there is a recognizable individuality in route choice already from when the birds depart from the breeding grounds. So to quickly sum up our findings, we found strong site fidelity both in breeding and main wintering sites of our nightjars, and a high repeatability in routes during autumn, but more variable levels of repeatability during spring migration. And future work related to this involves to look into the consistency and repeatability in the timing of annual events, as well as the distribution of fueling sites across latitudes during migration. And with that, I want to acknowledge the people involved in this study, and I also want to thank you for attending this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel, for sharing this incredible insights into Nightjar migration. We have time for some questions, and evidently Gabriel is available for live Q&A. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. While we are waiting for an answer, maybe I can pose a question, if that's okay.
You're welcome.
I was wondering, the low variation between individuals when they almost arrive in the wintering areas, could that be that they use a certain corridor or something to enter their wintering sites, or?
You mean the low variation between individuals?
Sorry, yeah.
Or within?
Between individuals, yes.
Okay. Yeah, well, I haven't really looked into that much, but yeah, when you mentioned it, I think there seem to be some kind of concentrations of individuals and in certain areas from the Swedish population, and perhaps also from other European populations. I guess we should compare that one day. So yeah, it could be some kind of migration corridors in southern tropical Africa as well. Yeah.
Really nice. There is one more question. So yeah, maybe one quick question from the Nightjaring group. Repeatability in the strict sense is often taken as a measure of heritability. how does it fit into your observation of variability within ID repeatability depending on latitude? And they say thank you.
Okay. Yeah, well, that's a good question, and probably I need to expand it further in the chat, I guess. But yeah, that's yeah. I think probably there are some heritability in migratory checkpoints, so to speak, and that's why you find high repeatability. And then the reason why we find general repeatability along the tracks, that may actually be because there's not a lot of external factors influencing the actual routes. So I guess that's the thing one have to remember, that the variation, the within individual variation is also influenced of the variation in the external factors, like, for example, winds.
All right. I suppose that propose that if you have any time today, you can answer the questions in the chat. And with that, we can move on to our next speaker, which is Michiel Lathouwers, and he's a PhD student at the University of Hasselt and the University of Namur in Belgium. And he is going to talk about assessing the effect of global change on avian migratory pathways, and he's using the European Nightjar as a case study.
Hi everyone, I'm Michiel Lathouwers, PhD candidate at the University of Hasselt and Namur in Belgium. In this talk, I will give you a brief overview of a portion of the research that I've been doing for the last few years, looking at the effects of global change on avian migration. Migration is a phenomenon found across a wide range of animal taxa. However, the most spectacular journeys are undoubtedly found in birds. Annual migrations enable individuals to maximize their chances of survival and reproductive success by providing, for example, refuge from predation or unfavorable environmental conditions, while allowing individuals to gain access to higher quality or more abundant food resources and escape competition. However, the continent-wide migrations of many bird species come with some vulnerabilities, as these migrants' reliance on environmental resources in geographically distinct areas throughout the annual cycle leave them particularly vulnerable to human-induced threats, which is why these extraordinary journeys may not persist forever. Human-induced threats can be classified as direct, such as the increased mortality as a result of collisions with human infrastructure, or also illegal hunting. However, perhaps more importantly, indirect anthropogenic threats are drastically altering birds' natural habitats. For example, the expansion of urban and agricultural land have many times been linked to declines in migratory birds. In association also, for example, the use of agrochemicals may also affect species through habitat degradation and reduction in prey availability. Changes in land use may have further combined negative effects as a result of climate change, which can cause further habitat degradation through increasing temperatures, flooding, or desertification. Additionally, long-distance migrants may be unable to adapt their timing of their annual migration to rapid climatic changes that occur elsewhere, causing a phenological mismatch between energy demands and suitable environmental conditions to support these demands. Understanding how the complex interplay of environmental factors and individual traits influence movement and space use throughout the annual cycle is therefore essential to understanding population dynamics, evolutionary processes, and the impacts of global change on migratory birds. To assess this, I have been working with a strange-looking bird, which you've probably heard way too much about already today, the European Nightjar, or simply the Nightjar, as I'll refer to it during the rest of this talk. Nightjars are typical long-distance migrants which visit their Palearctic breeding areas in the summer months, between May and September in the case of Flanders, and spend the rest of their time either on the move or on their wintering sites in subtropical Africa. We've been working on this species in the east of Belgium, in the province of Limburg, for about 12 years now. Here we trap individuals in a series of heathland reserves, which form the main breeding habitat for nightjars in Belgium. We and our collaborators in the UK at the British Trust for Ornithology equip captured individuals with miniaturized GPS loggers and multi-sensor geolocators, which allows us to reconstruct spatiotemporal and behavioral aspects of individual annual migrations. Using these tracking data, we've constructed a species distribution model to assess suitable habitat for nightjars across their migratory flyway, based on high-resolution remote sensed land cover datasets. Subsequently, we used this model in conjunction with projected land use data for the following decades under various socioeconomic and carbon emission scenarios to forecast changes in the amount of suitable habitat in the coming decades for nightjars. And what are the results? Perhaps unsurprisingly, the results are not good. Under all but one of the scenarios, the amount of suitable habitat will drastically decrease by 2100. The worst case scenario, where socioeconomic conditions and development of energy crops to keep emissions low cause an increased agricultural expansion, which is forecasted to result in a loss of over half of the current suitable habitat for nightjars in their flyway. But even in the best case scenario, where open habitats are predicted to increase in Central Africa, this still means a major alteration in the spatial distribution of this suitable habitat. Now, knowing this, of course, the logical next question is, well, what does this mean for nightjars? And to answer that question, it becomes important to get to know more about what determines a nightjar's migration. The innate basis of migration in general has been known for decades with experiments of migratory restlessness in caged birds. But in order to arrive from this endogenous migration program to a realized migration, this innate program is modified by a series of exogenous factors. Think of, for example, the well-known example of pied flycatchers and their phenotypic flexibility in timing their arrival at the breeding site, but also blackcaps or more recently pink-footed geese changing their migration routes. And in the context of long-distance migration, species with more diverse migratory behaviors and higher levels of flexibility are actually predicted to suffer less from population declines resulting from global change. In our previous studies, we have shown how European nightjars adopt flexible time allocation strategies in response to environmental conditions encountered en route. Nightjars actually exploit food resources in an opportunistic way during active travel segments of their migration, possibly limiting the time they need to spend on stopovers and relieving them from time constraints in their annual cycle. Furthermore, our more recent work has shown how migrating nightjars appear to be niche switchers, which vary certain aspects of their ecological niche in order to adjust habitat use to accommodate seasonal life history requirements. The niche management strategy employed by migrants and the ability to use alternative approaches during migration will likely determine their ability to persist under future global change, as it allows them to maximize their fitness through variable environments. We also found that when nightjars select a stopover site, they tend to favor areas with diverse land cover types distributed in the landscape in a non-aggregated way. This likely allows them to quickly allocate food resources and again avoid spending time looking for the most optimal feeding habitat. So these demonstrations of flexible behaviors likely serve to buffer adverse impacts of unforeseen negative conditions resulting from global change, while still actually adhering to a strict spatiotemporal migration schedule in order to limit fitness costs. In conclusion, as our research shows, even the most drastic changes in our collective mindset towards the value of our natural environment will likely not allow us to avoid negative consequences. While this should not be seen as an excuse to stop trying to shift patterns of global change, I think that these facts need to be addressed in conservation goals. For example, adopting change-forward conservation actions which build upon insights into avian migrants' flexibility by, for example, developing dynamic protected areas and conservation plans may be an important tool in ensuring the persistence of avian migrants. Second, technological advancements have only recently made it possible to study avian migration into this kind of detail. And results so far have shown wide-ranging levels of this flexibility, which are very much context and species specific. Therefore, more research into this topic is definitely needed. And additionally, another important knowledge gap lies in identifying how these factors may ultimately affect demographic and population dynamics. Relatively few studies have been able to track enough individuals for long enough periods of time to characterize the full range of migratory behaviors exhibited across their lifespan. Also among different demographic groups in a population or across the entire geographic range of a species. So therefore, there is an urgent need for long-term and collaborative monitoring to evaluate the status of long-distance migrants in our changing world. So thank you for listening. Thank you for the opportunity to give this talk. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
All right, thanks a lot, Michiel. Michiel is here and he's available for live Q&A. So if anyone has a question for Michiel, please put it in the chat. So maybe meanwhile, I can ask a question again. So your scenarios, they seem quite dramatic. Is there some way or somehow that we might be able to focus conservation of certain areas? Would that help the conservation of these migratory routes of the species or not?
Yeah, I think definitely. For example, yeah, the research that Gabriel showed earlier, long-term tracking efforts, as I mentioned, can definitely help in focusing conservation efforts, and also in the context of understanding the fundamentals of migration. I think this can also help in directing the limited budget and time that's available for conservation.
So there is a question from Becky. Did you find any migrants going in the reverse direction in fall to exploit a food resource?
That's an interesting question. I think If I'm not mistaken, we have a track where an individual is shown to turn back, but I think it's more likely to be an effect of adverse weather conditions, where an individual was not able to cross one of the ecological barriers. But yeah, it's an interesting insight, definitely.
Yes, and she adds that she's observing the same in New Hampshire, the common nighthawks. All right, thank you, Michiel. So if there are any more questions for Michiel, please put them in the chat. With that, I would like to close the 6th session on migration, and we are due for a short break. There is a slight change in the schedule. So instead of coming back at 6:45 UTC, we come back at 7 to start the 7th session on Nightjar stories. So let's be back at 7 UTC. Meanwhile, you might use the chat to communicate a bit further. The chat is very alive, so thank you for that. And there is also our Padlet site where you can still see the posters that have been submitted for this conference. So if you want to see the session room on poster, then please go to the Padlet link that will be appearing in the chat. There it is. Okay, so see you back at 7 UTC. All right. Welcome, everyone. We're about to start the 7th session of this conference. So again, I would like to encourage everyone to keep posting their questions in the chat. If you want more information about a code of conduct, or if you want to give feedback on the meeting, you want some information on merchandise or how to donate for the small grants program, please check the chat as well. The Padlet link will be there as well for the posters if you didn't have time to check them yet. And then now I would like to start the 7th session, which is on the Nightjar stories. And our first speaker is Jared Del Rosso, who is a cultural sociologist at the University of Denver. And he will talk about the first whippoorwill. The presentation will start in a few seconds.
Hi there, my name is Jared Del Rosso. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Denver. The title of my talk today is The First Whippoorwill, Origins and Legacies of Nightjar Lore in the US. What I'm presenting on today is a portion of work that comes from a book I'm writing on whippoorwills and US culture. It's tentatively titled The Lonesome Whippoorwill, The Untold Story of America's Most Iconic Bird. It's under contract with New York University Press. It's still a long ways from being finished and even longer from then being in print. But I'm optimistic that maybe by winter 2025 or spring 2024, I can see this book into the world. The hope with this book is to kind of tell the story of the place that whippoorwills and nightjars more generally and birds most generally have had in US culture, and how that place has kind of shaped how we relate to the birds and how we relate to the environment more generally. So what I'm talking to you about today is from a chapter I've written on superstition and lore surrounding whippoorwills. I've focused, though not exclusively, on the first whippoorwill. What I did to kind of form the basis of this chapter is look at newspaper articles mentioning the first whippoorwill. I've put this together from a couple different databases. This was a sort of preliminary count, and I found 440 articles mentioning the first whippoorwill, the vast majority of which come from one century, 1870 to about 1970. And you see this kind of precipitous decline in reporting on the first whippoorwill with the 1940s. 177 of those 440 articles indeed shared a report of the first whippoorwill of the year. So at one point, American communities were letting each other know when whippoorwills came back to their communities, their towns, their regions. I've logged the date when available of most of those returns, and if that's something that interests you, please let me know. I'm happy to share them. But the vast majority of those dates are from April and May, kind of as we would expect. I want to show you what some of these reports would look like, So here's from a Wisconsin newspaper in 1886. This was like a multi-column section on local news. And at the very top, the right-hand side of that second column, you see, you can turn your cows out next Monday. And also, last Wednesday night, April 14, we heard the first whippoorwill of the season, which is a sign that spring is opened and that it is time to go barefooted. Fast forward a century to the 1970s, you have this local news in the Logan Daily News, a newspaper out of Ohio, written by Ethel Pauling. You see how Pauling has reported on some of the comings and goings of people in the town, people in her lives. And amid that, we have the second paragraph, which reads, Mrs. Viola Wagner heard the first whippoorwill Tuesday evening, April 22nd. And I drew from this paper in particular, because this is one of the last places in the country that I found that was consistently reporting on whippoorwills and their return to the communities. So Ethel Pauling was one of 3 journalists who in their local news reports, their kind of community sections of the newspaper, were fairly consistently reporting when the first whippoorwill of the year was heard. So I thought that was that's kind of remarkable that it was persisting into this community into the 1970s. The Logan, Ohio Daily News also reported on the activities of a naturalist club called the Wheaton Club, which at least in the 1960s was holding something called the Whippoorwill Derby. The Wheaton Club was a statewide naturalist organization. It was all men, though. It didn't admit women into its ranks. And in the 1960s, they held get-togethers that they called Whippoorwill Derbies, in which they'd get together, they'd think about the weather for that day, the moon phase for that day, and they'd make predictions on when the first whippoorwill of the night would sing. Not the first whippoorwill of the year, but the first whippoorwill of a night. And so they would go out and listen for the bird and see whose prediction most got it right. But why were communities waiting for whippoorwills? Why were communities listening for them? And why were they sharing the news? It's largely because whippoorwills were important seasonal signs for the better part of several centuries. The most important sign that they were of is part of the natural cycle, the movement from winter to spring. And there was a belief that the first whippoorwill of the year meant an end to frost, that you wouldn't hear the first whippoorwill of the spring until frost had ended. There was also some belief that you could predict the timing of certain flowers. In Missouri, hawthorns were said to bloom when the first whippoorwill would sing. And there's kind of a lovely poem published in the early 1920s, recognizing when hawthorns were named the state flower of Missouri, and that poem contains a passage relating it to the first whippoorwill of the year. But with the end of frost, the whippoorwill had important implications for the calendar of people who were engaged in farming activities. So most importantly, it was time to plant frost-sensitive crops, most notably corns and beans, but in the US South, also tobacco. And this was a belief attributed to Native Americans as early as 1778. So this was a century-long belief that it wasn't time to plant your frost-sensitive crops, in the East at least, until you heard the first whippoorwill of the year. As you saw in that Wisconsin newspaper, but I also found this in a Missouri newspaper, the first whippoorwill song also meant something for people who raised cattle. It was time to release them into pastures because the grains and grasses would be mature enough for them to successfully graze. Whippoorwills also had kind of implications for people's everyday lives. You saw in one of those earlier newspapers that it was time to go barefooted. And the lore around this was largely that it was time for children to finally play outside barefooted when they heard the first whippoorwill of the year. Some families would stop collecting firewood when they heard the first whippoorwill. But my favorite example of kind of a lifestyle change attached to the first whippoorwill comes from Alabama in the 1940s. In a newspaper article that circulated fairly widely in its time, I've counted it in at least 27 newspapers. That's probably an undercount because not all these papers are well archived in the databases I have access to. It tells the story of a man named R.H. Griggs, known to those around him as Uncle Rip, who would get two haircuts each year, the first in the spring when he heard the whippoorwills sing. But there were other reasons to listen for the first whippoorwill of the year. There were a number of superstitions surrounding the bird and what the first whippoorwill could bring. So there was superstitions around folk medicine. These usually held that if you did 3 somersaults or you rolled over 3 times when hearing the first whippoorwill, you'd be without back pain for the rest of the year. Of course, if you're willing to do 3 somersaults or 3 three rolls on the still probably cold evening ground. When you hear a first whippoorwill, probably your back's in good enough shape that you won't indeed experience back pain for a year. There was beliefs that if you had a pocket full of coins or a purse full of coins when you heard the first whippoorwill of the year, you'd have wealth all year. But the most famous superstitions concerned life, love, and death. The idea here being that if you counted the number of times the whippoorwill said his name when you heard him for the first time that year, that would predict either the years you had remaining in your life, or if you were single, the years until marriage. Briefly, I just want to talk to you a little bit about the origins of most of these beliefs, because interestingly, they don't really come from European beliefs around nightjars. At least this set doesn't. They come from European beliefs around the common cuckoo. So different birds, different families, but existing within comparable, in a sense, cultural niches in Europe and the US, partly because their arrival coincides with the season change from winter to spring. They have conspicuous and iconic songs that are repetitive, repeatable, and that you can indeed count, and both, of course, sing their name. So existing within similar kind of cultural niches or serving, in a sense, the same cultural function. Briefly, I just want to end by talking a little bit about the legacies of these beliefs. As I showed you earlier, we see a precipitous decline in articles mentioning the first whippoorwill starting around the time of the Second World War and kind of exhausting itself in the mid-1970s. So we can think about this moment, a time of pretty rapid suburbanization, a kind of distancing of everyday life from the environment and nature, also, of course, an increase in the use of pesticides, and also, as we know, pretty rapid decline in whippoorwill populations. So in a sense, as the bird and our lives are separating, as our everyday lives are distancing us from the song of all whippoorwills, but certainly that first whippoorwill, what we see is a decline in concern, a decline in newspaper reporting, communal attention to, and sharing of the arrival date of that first whippoorwill. But this doesn't mean that some of the superstition and lore disappears. It persists predominantly in some of those omens and superstitions surrounding life and death. So I've told you, if you counted the first whippoorwill song, how many times he repeats his name, that might predict your death. But as I'm sure many of you know, not the first whippoorwill, but any whippoorwill singing close to a person's home was an ill omen for early US Americans. It was an omen of potential illness, potential death within the household. This was widely believed, widely believed bit of lore. I've seen it documented in the American Journal of Folklore, in the US South, and also in New England. And it's this set of beliefs that has persisted in US culture, but not kind of as a ritual or part of everyday life, but instead in our horror fiction. So the most famous horror fiction using the whippoorwill is H.P. Lovecraft's novella or short story, The Dunwich Horror, set in central Massachusetts, a story of about 17,000 words in which Lovecraft references whippoorwills about 21 times. And in the story, the whippoorwill is engaged in unnatural behaviors, flocking, persisting in central Massachusetts into very late October. And the presence of the bird always coincides with an impending death. In fact, they chant their name with the breaths in unison, the whole flock in unison, with the breaths of dying characters. What's interesting to me is that when the story is made into a movie in the 1970s, whippoorwills are erased and a single great horned owl, perhaps a more familiar kind of ominous night bird, is used in their place. So again, this is the time where kind of communal listening and watching for the first whippoorwill of the year is beginning to decline. And at the same time, horror film is erasing whippoorwills from a Hollywood adaptation of the Dunwich Horror. Stephen King has also used whippoorwills in his own writing, most famously in the film or in the novel Salem's Lot, which he wrote in 1975. It was made into a film in 1979, and in that film, whippoorwills are nowhere to be found. In their place, a sort of generic bird is referenced, and the call of this bird sounds to me like they spliced a crow and a gull together to make kind of a harsh, ominous cry. The novel is also made into a TV show in 2004. Again, whippoorwills are not mentioned in that adaptation. Birds are not really, don't really figure in that as well. Interestingly to me, the movie, a new movie has been made in very recently, but it hasn't been released. So I'm awaiting the release of this new adaptation of Salem's Lot to see if whippoorwills figure in it, because I think there's an increase in interest in being accurate in the invocation of birds in some of this material. I say that because in Stephen King's short story Jerusalem's Lot, which was made into a television show in 2021, whippoorwills are brought back. So whippoorwills figure in that 1978 story Jerusalem's Lot, and in the 2021 film about this vampire story, we do have indeed whippoorwills, and they figure in almost every episode. You can hear their call. They're a plot point along the way, and the show goes to great lengths to educate their reader, educate their watcher, excuse me, in the presence of the bird. At one point, a flock of them erupts during the day, and one of the characters says something like, "Strange, I never see whippoorwills during the day." So they're brought back into the kind of Hollywood universe of horror fiction. In closing, I just want to say a couple of things. This is an ongoing research project, and if there are ways in which you'd like to support or help or just learn more, I'm looking for, in the long run, potential readers, particularly of a chapter I plan to write on the natural history of the bird, but also my closing chapters on conservation. I'm not an ornithologist, but I want to get the bird's natural history as right as possible. So I'd really appreciate potential readers of that. If you have really excellent photographs of whippoorwills, I'm looking to potentially use some. It'll be up to the publisher to really decide which fit the book best and which fit their production best, but I am looking for really high quality photographs of whippoorwills in or out of their favorite habitats. I'm also looking to travel into the whippoorwills breeding ranges in the spring and summer of 2024 to potentially participate or help with surveys for the bird, or simply learn from you and your own surveys or research of whippoorwills. So if that's something you'd be open to, having me kind of tag along and potentially write about the work that's being done around whippoorwills, especially around conservation, I'd really appreciate that. And finally, in closing, I want to thank a couple people. My friend and fellow birder, Jeff Stacks, a faculty member with DU's writing program, who's been providing me really excellent feedback on my chapters. Emma Wright, a criminology major, who was an undergraduate research assistant with me last year, who analyzed something like 150 pop music songs mentioning whippoorwills, as well as online comments folks had made about the bird. And finally, the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, which provided some of the funding supporting that work. Again, email me with any questions. My email is jareddelrosso@du.edu. You can check out my website if you want to see more kind of about what I'm up to with the bird. Thanks for your time today. I look forward to talking to you more about the work.
Well, thanks a lot, Jared. We really enjoyed this talk. Thank you so much for sharing it. Jared is here with us and available for Q&A. So maybe one quick question. Well, they're long questions, so I propose that you maybe answer them in the chat, and then maybe find people in the breakout rooms during the general discussion. We really liked it a lot, so thank you so much for doing this. And with that, we go to our last presentation of the day, which is by Victor Antonelli. He's a master's at Unesp Botucatu in Brazil, and he's going to talk about caprimulgets of Botucatu in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
Over the last 9 years, I've been collecting data on nocturnal birds, including owls, putus, but especially nightjars, in the city of Botucatu, São Paulo. Botucatu is located in Midwest São Paulo, southeastern Brazil, where attention zone or ecotone unwinds between two hotspots of biodiversity, the Cerrado and the Atlantic Forest. At least 7 species of nightjars can be found in nowadays in Botucatu, and only two lack registration since the 90s, the long-trained Nightjar and the silky-tailed Nightjar. Well, over the last 9 years, I visited at least 18 hotspots, all present on birding online platform eBird. And this is the perimeter of Botucatu. Most pink represent urban sites, green most forest, and yellow agricultural fields. And most of the species are forest dependent, at least for resting, except for the Common Nighthawk, which roosts on fields and prefer more open spaces, has more gregarious behavior, and is more unpredictable compared to other nightjars, with most observations during fall and winter. Sometimes at urban sites. And on contrast, two species are regular seasonal migrants, the short-tailed nighthawk and the little nighthawk, which also occur next to urbanized areas and visit the city between spring and summer, leaving before fall. Most common species and that can be seen all year are the scissor-tailed nightjar and the common parroquet. These also occur next to urbanized areas, but mostly at agricultural sites. And others have a more restricted occurrence, not occurring next to urbanized areas, and inhabiting only less disturbed habitats, case of the rufous nightjar, and especially the ocellated porwheel, which tends to be the most forest dependent of all, and has not been registered in fragments below 40 hectares till present. All of the species above can be seen at a single location called Yvyja'u Experimental Farm, where I conduct most of my surveys. And on June 26th of this year at 10 p.m., while attempting to record an owl, I also record an unknown bird, which seemed to be a nightjar. Some suggest maybe a silky-tailed nightjar, which has been absent for over 30 years. And if any of you could give me a light, I'll play the recording. If it's a silky-tailed nightjar, it would be awesome. And thank you for your time. I hope you enjoy and have a nice Congress. My contact is on the corner below. And again, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Victor. Victor is here with us, but unfortunately, I think we have to go to the general discussion. So if you have any questions for Victor, please put them in the chat. So concerning the general discussions, I think in a few seconds, there will be a pop-up window on your screen showing the different breakout rooms with different topics. So if you want to attend any of the discussion rooms, then you can just click on the topic and then you will be directed automatically to one of these rooms. Please, if anyone is in these rooms, can someone take the role of a moderator or someone that takes simple notes? That would be very helpful for us. It doesn't have to be very advanced, just maybe tell us what you have been talking about. Or get this chance to get to know each other. And besides these discussion rooms, there is also still the poster session room. So you can attend that as well. So if any of the committee members wants to add something to that, to see if it works with the breakout rooms or not.
Hi, folks. I am just adding those in now. I got wrapped up in all these amazing talks. So I've created a room around breeding ecology, migration, a room for poster authors to go and answer questions, a room on nocturnal habits, and then a meet and greet, which would just be casual. So I'm going to open those rooms. You can join them yourself. Remember to go look at the More button, and you can click on breakout rooms, and then you should see the names of the rooms and a join button. And one of us will stay here in the main room in case anyone has any questions. Thanks and enjoy your chats.
All right, thank you, Maria. So we meet again at 7:50 UTC. All right, let's wait a few seconds until everyone has returned. Yeah, I think most of us are back. So I hope that these breakout rooms were interesting. And with that, I unfortunately have to announce that we are coming to the end of this second day of the conference, but also to the end of the conference of this year. I think if I can wrap up, that we had 2 wonderful days wherein we had the privilege to dive into the mysterious life of nightjars. While we traveled from the USA to Asia to Europe, back to Africa and South America, we learned a lot about kutus, Chordeiles, Chordeiles widows, and of course, other species of real nightjars. We learned about how they breed, how they migrate, and how they behave at night. And we heard fascinating nightjar stories as well. But most importantly, I think we also learned how to take care of us as being nightjar researchers yesterday from Carlos. We had inspiring contributions from students, PhDs, postdocs, even artists, and actually everyone in here who is a nightjar fanatic. Thanks to Jared. From now on, we know that we have to do 3 supersalts at the beginning of each nightjar season to see if we are still fit to perform another year of nightjar research. And maybe the most exciting announcement of the day is that if you still hadn't had enough nightjar stories or nightjar research information, all the talks have been recorded, and we will put them online in a few weeks when everything is edited. I will also want to mention the shop, the gift shop, or the shop with all the equipment of nightjar t-shirts and stuff on Redbubble. I think it will appear on the chat or in the chat, and there is still the place for the donations of the research program. We would very welcome feedback from the conference to see what we can change or what we can improve for the next year. I think you can also visit the groups.io website. In case you are interested in joining the steering committee, we are seeking a new student committee member, especially if you're someone from the Global South and interested in joining the steering committee. Please send your or contact us via the email address steeringcommittee@nightjars.groups.io. I think it will also appear in the chat. And with that, I would like to thank our moderators for keeping track of all the posts in the chat and keeping all the links up to date in the chat, as you can see happening right now. Special thanks to Gabriel for all the background work. He has been setting up all the presentations in the past couple of days, tracking all the presence of the presenters and keeping things running smoothly. But most importantly, thanks for everyone who participated, all the presenters. You have made this an inspiring Nightjar meeting and a fun meeting as well. So thank you for that. My final words will actually be the words from Carlos. Yesterday, he ended his presentation